It's you. You are always welcome here. Guardian, a Random House audiobook by John Saul. Narrated by Meriwether. Brought to you here by T-Set Audio.
It was just the kind of day that never failed to depress her. The sense of impending disaster only worsened as the temperature skyrocketed. August in Canaan, New Jersey. Temperature 93 degrees, humidity 97%, and both climbing. Canaan, where MaryAnne Carpenter had been born and where, she thought wryly, it was beginning to look as if she was going to die. If she weren't dead already, which this morning seemed a definite possibility. Obviously, if she was dead, she must have sinned a lot more than she realized. Suddenly, the back door slammed open and her daughter's voice cut through her brooding thoughts. "Isn't Dad here yet?" MaryAnne stifled the tart response that rose in her throat, determined not to contaminate 13-year-old Allison's relationship with her father. "He said noon, but you know your father." Allison glanced at the clock. "So, he won't be here for another 45 minutes. Just like I told Logan. Mom, can I ask you something?" "You know you can ask me anything, sweetheart." Allison took a deep breath. "Well, Logan and I are sort of wondering, are you and Dad going to get back together again?" Now, how on earth am I going to answer that one, MaryAnne thought. How do I tell her that the last thing I want to do is go back to living with Alan Carpenter? Except that maybe it was the only thing she could do, given the circumstances. Everyone knew that love and money should properly have nothing to do with each other. Then she had looked around the house and begun to wonder. The wallpaper had badly deteriorated, along with everything else. "Didn't I tell you you should have painted in the first place?" Alan had asked when she called. "I just don't have the money for new wallpaper." "But you had money to take little Miss Blondie to Bermuda, didn't you?" MaryAnne had thought bitterly as she'd slammed the phone down. By the next morning, she'd calmed down enough to realize that Alan hadn't had enough money to take Eileen Chandler to Bermuda. Eileen must have paid for the trip herself. She'd spent the rest of that day engulfed all over again in the pain of losing her husband to a woman who was younger and prettier and had plenty of money as well. Blind. She'd been utterly, hopelessly blind until the night 6 months ago when Alan had announced he was moving in with another woman. Next morning, she had had to explain to Allison and Logan that their father had gone to live somewhere else. Could anyone begrudge MaryAnne her glee when Susan Weinstock had called last month to say, "Guess what? Little Miss Blondie threw Alan out"? It was one moment of sweet revenge, which quickly soured into confusion when Alan called to tell her that things haven't worked out with Eileen and I've moved out. "Really?" MaryAnne had replied. "What happened?" Alan barely hesitated. It was you, honey. I found out it was you I love, not Eileen." Another lie. MaryAnne hung up. Alan was relentless, calling daily, but it wasn't until he'd admitted that Eileen had thrown him out that MaryAnne finally agreed to this family barbecue a week before Labor Day. As MaryAnne searched for the right words to answer Allison, the front doorbell rang, and a moment later Logan charged in. "It's Daddy!" the 10-year-old shouted. "He's early!" MaryAnne's eyes went to the clock and a faint smile curled the corners of her mouth. Only half an hour late, which for Alan was a record of punctuality. Maybe after all, he really had changed, really was sorry for what had happened. Or maybe he just figured it would be a lot cheaper to move back into the house. MaryAnne stood up to greet her husband, still not sure whether she was glad to see him or not. More than 2,000 miles from Canaan, New Jersey, Ted Wilkenson stepped out onto the front porch of his house near Sugarloaf, Idaho, and breathed deeply. As he did every day, Ted paused to savor his good fortune in having discovered the valley nearly 14 years ago, when it was still an unknown speck in the mountains north of Sun Valley. Ted's ranch had grown from its original 300 acres to more than 1,000. Both Ted and Audrey were well aware of the irony that their current low-tech lifestyle was a direct result of Ted's former high-tech experience in Silicon Valley. They were using the profits from the immensely successful software company Softworks, which Ted had founded in California, to protect their private wilderness in Idaho. Ted and Audrey had discovered Sugarloaf together only a month after they'd discovered each other. Ted had come up for a weekend respite. He met Audrey the first night and wound up staying the summer, running Softworks by phone. On the last Sunday of the summer, they'd driven over Galena Summit and stared in awe at the Sawtooth Valley. "This is it," Ted had finally murmured. "This is paradise. Now, all we have to do is find the perfect spot." Finally, they'd stumbled into the Sugarloaf Valley. The village near the mouth of the valley appeared as perfect as a set for a Western movie. At the end of the road, they'd come upon a sign offering 300 acres together with a house and barn for sale. "Here it is," Ted had said. "Here is what?" Audrey had asked. "Here is where we're going to live after we get married." "Looks all right to me," Audrey heard herself reply. The farm duly purchased, they decided to finish the job they'd started, so they picked up a license at the courthouse and got married before dinner. "You're sure there isn't anyone you want at the wedding?" Ted had asked, but Audrey had shaken her head. There was only MaryAnne, her best friend, but she was 2,000 miles away. Joey had been born less than a year after they were married, and Ted had essentially retired from Softworks. The ranch slowly grew, and over the years, the Wilkensons slipped easily into the fabric of the town. So here Ted was, not quite 40, living in his idea of paradise with a wife who was his best friend, and raising his son. His son, the only fly in the ointment, Ted thought, but he reminded himself that Joey seemed to be getting better. Joey had had strange moods when he wouldn't speak for hours or would disappear from the house for the entire day. Discipline was all the boy had needed, really. "He's not a baby anymore," he told Audrey the first time he'd taken his belt to Joey's backside. "Your way hasn't worked, so now we'll try it my way." The boy had finally stopped resisting the punishment. And he had stopped crying to his mother, Ted recalled with satisfaction. Joey was, he figured, finally growing up. A feeling of well-being surging through him, Ted stepped into the barn. He led Sheikah, the black Arabian mare that was his favorite, to the cross ties, tethered her, and then began the process of mucking out the horse's stall. Sheikah suddenly whinnied nervously and pawed at the ground. "It's okay, Sheikah." But the horse tugged against the restraining tethers. "Hey, settle down, old girl," Ted soothed, moving toward the horse. Sheikah ignored him, her eyes fixed on the open door of the barn. "What is it, girl? What's wrong?" Ted glanced toward the door, but the brilliant sunlight outside blinded him. "Joey? Sykes? Is someone out there?" But he knew his son had gone fishing, and he'd seen Bill Sykes, his caretaker, drive off toward town. What the hell was going on? Suddenly he felt vaguely uneasy. For a while now, strange things had been happening on the ranch. The horses had been spooking, and every now and then Ted himself had experienced the unsettling sensation of being watched. Now he called out yet again, "Who is it? Is anyone out there?" There was still no answer. Ted at last turned back to Sheikah. The big mare seemed calm, but a sound startled her. Instinctively Ted turned, but all he saw was a flash of movement before the horse reared up, her front hooves striking out. Sheikah's right hoof struck Ted in the back of the head, felling him instantly. Then the horse reared again and plunged back down, neighing loudly as the form in the doorway drew closer. Her great left hoof smashed into Ted's right temple, the bone shattering under the immense weight of the animal. The horse reared again, finally jerking free of the tethers, then lunged out of the stall. A moment later she was gone, racing across a field toward the woods beyond. Inside the barn, the other horses panicked, whinnying loudly, rearing up, but then the presence was gone as quickly as it had come, and Ted Wilkenson lay dead on the floor, his head resting in a pool of his own blood. MaryAnne gazed out the kitchen window. Allison was clearing the last of the supper dishes off the outdoor table. Logan and Alan stood at opposite ends of the small lawn, hurling a softball back and forth. For the kids, it was almost as if their father had never been gone. MaryAnne had begun wondering if, after all, Alan might have had a change of heart. She had to acknowledge she'd enjoyed the day. "Mom," Allison asked anxiously as she came through the back door, "are you going to let Dad come home now?" The question jarred MaryAnne out of her reverie. I'm not sure," she said. "I just can't discuss it with you right now." "Then who can you discuss it with?" Allison demanded. Audrey, MaryAnne thought. I could discuss it with Audrey, except she's thousands of miles away. "Aunt Audrey," she said out loud. "I'll call her up tomorrow and see what she has to say." Audrey would help her figure out what to do. The shadows cast by the Sawtooth Mountains were already creeping down the valley as Audrey Wilkenson approached the gates to El Monte. As she started up the winding drive toward the house, she felt a vague sense of unease. The house looked no different. Shaking her head as if to toss off the uneasy feeling, she pushed the front door open. "Ted? Joey? Anyone home?" Silence. Which was not unusual, she told herself. Joey was probably still off fishing, and Ted was undoubtedly tending to the horses. Yet the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave her. Her apprehension growing stronger, Audrey left the house and started toward the barn. She paused outside the open barn door, listening to the horses moving restlessly in their stalls. She steeled her nerves, then strode through the door. She saw him, sprawled out on his back, his head twisted unnaturally to the right, his hair matted in a dark slime of drying blood. "Ted?" As Audrey grasped her husband's shoulders, his head rolled over and his eyes fixed on hers. In them was the unblinking gaze of death. Audrey struggled to her feet and staggered to the door. Then she was out of the barn and a howl of grief erupted from her. Emerging from the woods, Joey Wilkenson stopped short as his mother's agonized cry rolled over him. The German shepherd that was his constant companion laid his ears back. "Go on, Storm," he commanded. Only when the big dog reached his mother did Joey break into a run. As Audrey brokenly told him what had happened, Joey said nothing, understanding only one thing. His father would never beat him again. Almost in a trance, she led Joey back to the house, called Bill Sykes, then phoned the sheriff's office in Sugarloaf. After Ted's body had been taken away, Audrey was sitting on a low bench in the tack room. Deputy Martin crouched in front of her. "Audrey, can I talk to you?" She tried to focus on him. "What happened, Rick?" He shook his head. "From what I can see, he was mucking out Chica's stall. Something must have spooked the horse. Chica must have reared up, knocked him over, and then come down on his head." "Oh, what could have spooked Chica?" she asked. Rick shrugged. "Don't know. Could have been anything. You know horses." "Has anyone found her yet?" "Not yet. When we find her, His gaze shifted momentarily to Joey. "You'll shoot her, won't you?" Joey demanded. "I'm afraid we don't have much choice, Joey," Rick said. "She didn't do it on purpose," Joey flared. He jumped to his feet, his black hair falling over his forehead so that he looked much younger than his 13 years. "You can't kill her. You can't." Turning, he bolted out of the tack room. "I'm sorry, Audrey," Rick said. "I didn't handle that very well." "Oh, it's all right, Rick." Audrey pulled herself to her feet. "You know Joey's always had this thing with animals." Holding Rick's arm, she let him lead her back through the barn. Bill Sykes was still there. "I'll take care of everything, Miss Wilkenson," he said as she passed. "You just try and get some rest, okay?" Audrey paused, smiling at the caretaker. His weathered face made him look older than his 60 years. "Thank you, Bill. Somehow we'll get through this." "We will," Sykes assured her. "You need anything tonight, you call me. I got a bad feeling lately, like there's something up there in the mountains watching us." Audrey shivered. I'm "I'm sure I'll be fine," she said. She knew she wouldn't call him. Tonight she would sit alone in the den, trying to come to grips with what had happened. The 10 o'clock news was over. As she clicked the television off, Audrey realized she hadn't heard a word of it. She swung her legs up onto the couch, closing her eyes in a vain hope that she might drift off to sleep. But all that came were images of Ted. Then an image of her husband striking her son. It had only happened once, just once, she told herself, 2 years ago. They had known the moment Joey had come downstairs that one of his strange moods had come over him. He was silent, barely responding, and after breakfast he had simply disappeared, going off with Storm to wander in the woods. That evening, Ted had taken Joey out to the barn and beaten him. It had stunned Audrey. Just once, she repeated to herself, just once. But had there been other times? Audrey forcibly banished the image from her mind. "Go to bed," she told herself. Determinedly, she stood up, switching off the lamps and locking the outside door. Against what? That was something else that had only begun over the last couple of years, when they'd sensed something outside the house at night, something they could never quite be certain was there. She was at the foot of the stairs when she looked up to see Joey, still dressed, starting down, Storm at his heels. "Honey, why aren't you in bed?" "The barn," Joey said. "The door's closed. What about Sheikah? What if she comes back?" "All right," she said. "We'll leave it open." Together they went out. The moon was high in the cloudless sky. When they were halfway across the yard, Joey suddenly stopped and pointed. "Look, there she is!" Peering into the woods across the field, Audrey saw the great form of the mare move out of the shadows of the forest into the brilliant moonlight. Joey called out to her, "Sheikah! Sheikah! Come on, Sheikah!" With Storm trotting after him, Joey started running out toward the field. "Joey, stop! If we just leave the barn open, she'll go in." But even as she watched, the horse disappeared into the trees. "Get a tether, Mom!" he yelled. "I'll keep her in sight." Grabbing a rope and a flashlight, she saw Joey start down the path through the dense undergrowth. "Come on!" he yelled. Audrey switched on the flashlight, following in the direction her son had taken. She came to a fork in the trail 100 yards further on. Which way had Joey gone? "Joey! Joey, where are you?" She waited, but there was no response. Though the trail branched here, it came together again a few hundred yards further up, where it ended at a bluff that overlooked the entire Sugarloaf Valley. Whichever path she chose, she would eventually come upon her son. Sighing, she started the climb, choosing to take the right fork. She was still 100 yards from the bluff when she began to worry. Suddenly she paused, sensing something close by. She called out, but heard only silence. Danger. She sensed it all around her now and automatically turned, instinct warning her to run to the house. But she couldn't. Not with Joey still out here. She pushed on, refusing to let panic overcome her, calling out every few seconds now, but still hearing nothing in reply. She stepped out onto the edge of the bluff, gazing out over the valley. How many times had she and Ted stood here together? She froze, sensing that she was no longer alone. "Joey?" Her son's name died away into the silence. She heard something, a faint rustling behind her. She turned then. Almost invisible in the deep shadows, a dark form was slinking toward her. She gasped, stepped back, instinctively putting more distance between herself and the creature. Then it leaped, racing out of the darkness, hurtling toward her, its menace palpable. A scream of terror rose in Audrey's throat, and then she took another step backward, realizing too late that there was no longer anything beneath her foot. She teetered for a moment, then felt herself dropping. Her scream went on, only to end in sudden silence as she struck the rocks 200 feet below. MaryAnne jerked upright, her eyes opening wide as a scream echoed in her head. The voice that had awakened her had been clearly recognizable. Audrey Wilkenson. But it was crazy. Audrey was in Idaho. She glanced at the clock. 1:30. Only 11:30 in Idaho. What she really needed to do was to talk to Audrey, and not in the morning either. Maybe Audrey wasn't asleep yet. MaryAnne picked up the phone. "I think maybe you better follow me, Gilly," Rick Martin told his wife as he pulled the uniform on he'd just taken off a few hours earlier. "I don't know what's going on up there, but Joey sounded scared, and Bill Sykes isn't home." Less than 10 minutes later, the black and white Jeep that served as Rick's squad car and Gilly's little hatchback drove through the gate at El Monte. They went into the house. "Joey?" Rick asked. "What happened? Can you tell me about it?"
"I don't know,"
Joey wailed, wiping his tear-stained cheeks.
"I saw Sheikah out in the field, and Mom and I were trying to catch her, but, well, Mom was getting a rope. Sheikah went into the woods, so Storm and I followed her. I heard something in the woods. Whatever was out there frightened Storm, and I heard Mom calling me, but I was scared too. I mean, it was like something was hunting for me, and if I answered Mom, it could find me."
"Is that, when you came back here?" Rick asked. Joey shook his head.
"Me and Storm just stayed where we were, and then there was this scream like she was falling."
"Where were you, Joey?" Rick asked. Joey looked up.
"On the trail to the bluff, and after I heard it, Storm and me, we went to look for her, but when we got to the top of the bluff, we found—"
"What, Joey?" Rick pressed. "What did you find?"
"The flashlight. The one she got from the barn."
Joey stared down at Storm. As if sensing the boy's misery, the dog sat up and licked Joey's hand. "I think I'd better go have a look at the bluff," Rick said. Rick returned to the house. As he pushed the kitchen door open, he suspected that the boy already knew what had happened. Gilly looked at her husband questioningly, and he shook his head. "I'm, sorry, Joey. I found your mother. I guess she must have tripped." Joey looked up at him.
"She was calling me. If I'd answered her—"
Gilly drew him close.
"It wasn't your fault. It was an accident."
Joey gazed up at her.
"But what if it wasn't? What if—"
Gilly broke in.
"Joey, dear, we need to call someone." "There isn't anyone except Aunt MaryAnne."
"Aunt MaryAnne?" Gilly repeated.
"My godmother. She's my mom's best friend."
"Do you know where her number is?"
In the book, under Carpenter. Over there by the phone."
It wasn't until Audrey's address book was already in her hand that Gilly saw the message light blinking. Without thinking, she pressed the playback button. In silence, Gilly and Rick listened to the message Audrey's best friend had left no more than 10 or 15 minutes after Audrey had died. "It makes you wonder," Gilly thought as she dialed the New Jersey number. "You know, this is really nuts," Alan exclaimed, doing nothing to mask his fury as he watched MaryAnne throwing clothes into a suitcase. MaryAnne glared at him. "My best friend is dead, Alan, and so is her husband. How can I not go?" "But what can you do?" Alan argued. "There isn't anyone else, Alan. I'm all Joey has left." "Oh, Christ. They must have someone who'd take the kid in." "Joey." MaryAnne uttered the word with such force that Alan went silent. "His name is Joey, and I made a promise to Audrey years ago. We swore that if anything happened, we'd look after each other's kids. Well, something's happened, Alan. She's dead." Now both Allison and Logan appeared at the door. "Mommy?" Logan asked. "What's wrong?" Then, seeing the suitcase, the worry in his eyes turned to fear. "Are you going away?" "Something's happened," she told them. "Uncle Ted and Aunt Audrey have been in an accident, and I have to go out to Idaho and take care of Joey." It was Allison who understood what her mother was saying. You mean they're dead?" MaryAnne nodded. Logan looked as if he was about to cry. "But who's going to take care of us?"
Can't we go with you?
I'm afraid not, honey. But I won't be gone long. She shot Alan a glance over Logan's head. And while I'm gone, Daddy's going to take care of you. By the time she got out of the car at the airport, she and Alan were barely speaking to each other.
Ms. Carpenter? MaryAnne Carpenter?
MaryAnne had just stepped into the gate area of Boise Municipal Airport. She was certain that she must look even worse than she felt. But the rugged-looking man about 60 striding toward her seemed not to see the exhaustion she was feeling.
I'm Charlie Hawkins, he said as he took her suitcase. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. I was Ted and Audrey's attorney. This all the luggage you brought?
MaryAnne managed a nod, then let herself be steered along by Charlie's firm grip on her elbow. He kept up a steady patter of innocuous talk until they were well away from the airport, heading northeast on Highway 21. "What happened?" MaryAnne finally asked. Charlie shook his head sadly.
"Accidents, so far as anyone can tell," he began.
But the next few miles, the lawyer explained what details he knew, but his first sentence hung in MaryAnne's mind. "You said they were accidents, as far as anyone can tell. Is there some possibility that someone might have killed them?" Charlie glanced over at her.
There's a question about what could have spooked that horse, and there's a question of what made Audrey fall. Not that we're ever likely to find any answers, but
the word hung in the air between them. "Mr. Hawkins, is there something you're not telling me?" The lawyer's eyes remained steady on the road ahead.
Whenever there are two deaths close together and a lot of money is involved, there are going to be questions, Mrs. Carpenter."
"But who—" And then a thought came into her mind. "You can't be talking about Joey, can you? My God, he's just a little boy."
"Yeah, he wouldn't be the first 13-year-old to have killed his parents," Charlie replied.
"But Joey was crazy about his parents. There wasn't a problem, was there?"
"That depends on what you mean by a problem," the attorney hedged. "Joey's just starting into his teens, and that always means some kind of problem, doesn't it? So, just don't be surprised if the police want to talk to Joey, that's all."
"I see. But it seems so, I don't know, so far-fetched, I guess." Charlie offered her a faint smile.
"And it probably is. Anyway, there are other things you and I need to talk about. I assume you know you're Joey's guardian."
MaryAnne nodded. "Audrey and I made an agreement years ago. Of course, we never really thought it would ever happen."
"No one ever does, Mrs. Carpenter, but at least you two talked about it, and Ted and Audrey put it in writing. And a lot more, too."
"Oh, I assume the estate is complicated, and from what you just said, I'm the executor, too?"
"Not quite," Charlie corrected her. "I'm the executor, which means I will be dealing with all the paperwork. You're the trustee."
MaryAnne turned to gaze at him blankly. "The trustee? I thought I was Joey's guardian." Charlie turned to smile at her.
"Oh, you are, but when an estate is the size of Ted and Audrey Wilkenson's, and the main heir is a minor, things get complicated. It was not sufficient to make you the boy's guardian. They also made you the trustee of his estate."
Dear God, MaryAnne suddenly thought of the company in California in which Ted had a major interest. "What does that mean?"
"Well, for one thing, it means you and I are going to be doing a lot of business together. Ted and Audrey knew that if anything ever happened to them, you were going to need help."
"What kind of help, Mr. Hawkins?"
"Help managing a fortune. As of this morning, Joey is a very wealthy young man, and you are a rather wealthy woman."
"Me? I'm afraid I don't understand."
"It's pretty simple, really," Charlie explained. they decided that the position of guardian should not be without compensation.
Good Lord. How much is it?
1% of the total for every year until Joey's 21st birthday, which means that your share is 8% of the total.
MaryAnne felt a strange numbness. It's not possible.
Charlie smiled. Just be glad you were in New Jersey last night. If you'd been here, I'm afraid you'd be very high on my list of suspects.
They made the rest of the drive up to the ranch in silence. At last they passed through the gate to El Monte and pulled around the drive to the big lodge-like house. MaryAnne had just stepped out of the car when Joey burst out, throwing himself on her.
"Aunt MaryAnne, what are we going to do? Mom and Dad are—"
MaryAnne hugged him close. "It's going to be all right, Joey." The boy gazed up at her, his eyes fearful.
Are you going to take care of me?"
"Of course," she reassured him. "That's why I'm here." She gently led him back into the house, with Charlie following behind with her suitcase. Standing in the doorway was a small woman in her mid-30s. "I'm Gilly Martin," the woman said, offering MaryAnne her hand. "My husband's the senior deputy out here. You call me any time. There's plenty of food in the kitchen, and I got one of the guest rooms ready for you. I hope that's all right." "It's fine," MaryAnne assured her quickly. "You must want to go home." "Not until you're settled in," Gilly said. "I'll just call Rick, my husband. But I'll tell him to hold off for a while. I'm sure he'll want to talk to you, but not today, right?" MaryAnne nodded gratefully. By early evening, Gilly had left, and she was at the front porch saying goodnight to Charlie.
"Are you sure you feel all right about staying here tonight?" he asked.
"Oh, we'll be fine, thanks. Charlie, I've been thinking, I wonder if I shouldn't have my children come out." Charlie grasped what she was saying.
"Just let me know. I'll arrange for the tickets. And I'll have a checking account set up for you at the bank tomorrow morning."
As he got into his car, she waved. "Thanks again, Charlie." When he was gone, MaryAnne closed the door. In the space of 24 hours, her entire life had changed.
Logan was in Idaho on Aunt Audrey's ranch.
Thrilled not to have to share a room with his sister, he snuggled deep into the soft mattress and pulled the down comforter right up to his chin. After checking on Allison in her room, MaryAnne peeked in. "Ready for me to turn the light out?" she asked.
"Oh, but it's only 9 o'clock, Mom."
"And it's 11, where you woke up this morning." She bent down and kissed him, then snapped off the light. And as she started out, "Want me to leave the door open?"
"I'm not a baby,"
Logan protested. Pointedly silent, MaryAnne pulled the door closed. He drifted off to sleep, visions of forest creatures prowling through his mind. And because he was asleep, Logan missed the dark form that emerged from the woods beyond the pasture a few minutes later, lingering in the shadows as it stared at the lights glowing in the house. Lights that would soon go out, encouraging the shadowy figure to move closer. Alan gazed out the kitchen window the next morning, his eyes bleary from lack of sleep. Part of his restlessness, he knew, had resulted from the fight he had had with MaryAnne just before they'd gone to bed. When they had finally gone upstairs, she'd shown him to a room down the hall from her own. And Alan, his fury growing, had gone into the small guest room she'd delegated him and tried to get some sleep. The problem was that aside from his raging anger, the whole place gave him the creeps. The night was filled with noises he couldn't identify, so he'd lain awake all night, wondering why he'd come out here at all. Now, in the bright sunlight of morning, he felt no better. The kids were already out of the house, following Joey out to the barn, and MaryAnne was washing the breakfast dishes. "Don't get too comfortable," he said, his voice betraying his foul mood. "We go to the funeral this afternoon, and tomorrow morning we go back to New Jersey." MaryAnne shrugged. I just don't see how that's going to be possible. There's going to be a mountain of paperwork involved in settling the estate. It might be a good idea for me to stay out here with the kids for a while." Alan stood up abruptly. "You don't want to discuss a damn thing, do you?" "Well, that's just fine." He picked up the phone. As MaryAnne listened in silence, he made 2 phone calls, then left the kitchen without another word. By the time his dirty underwear was tossed back into his suitcase, Sugarloaf's lone taxi was just coming up the drive. MaryAnne came out of the kitchen as Alan hurried down the stairs. "You're going to walk out without even saying goodbye to the kids?" Alan's eyes fixed coldly on her. They should be used to it by now. He tossed his suitcase in the back of the taxi, then climbed into the passenger seat. "Boise, the airport." MaryAnne was just about to start getting ready for the funeral when a police car pulled up. A uniformed officer rapped loudly on the door. "MaryAnne Carpenter?" MaryAnne nodded. "I'm Rick Martin. I think you met my wife a couple days ago. Gilly Martin?" MaryAnne pulled the door wide open. "Of course. Won't you come in? I have some coffee." "No, thanks," he replied. "Actually, I'm here on business. I was just wondering if anyone here might have seen something last night. There was an attack at the campground." "The campground?" Rick began explaining. "It's a Coyote Creek campground. It adjoins the property. One of the campsites got torn up last night." MaryAnne looked up at the deputy. "Was anyone hurt?" Rick shook his head. "No one was there. The folks who were camped in the site had gone down to Sun Valley for the night. They didn't discover what had happened until this morning." "But what did happen?" she asked. Suddenly the back door opened and Joey, Logan, and Allison came inside. These are my children, Allison and Logan, and of course you know Joey. This is Deputy Martin." Though both Allison and Logan said hello to Rick, Joey said nothing. "I'm not sure what happened at the campsite," Rick began. "I still can't figure it out. This morning, a camper came into town, said his campsite had been destroyed. I followed him back there to make a report. The tent was in tatters, but there were no signs of knife marks. One of the sleeping bags had been torn in two. I searched the area for bear tracks." He shook his head. "Nothing. Lucky those people weren't there." MaryAnne noticed he'd been covertly keeping his eyes on Joey. Joey, though, said nothing, betraying no reaction at all. "What I was wondering," Rick went on, "was whether any of you heard anything last night or saw anything." Now Joey stirred. "I did. Something woke me up. I thought I saw someone outside." Rick felt his heartbeat quicken. "Did you actually see someone?" I'm not sure," Joey said. "It was just sort of a shadow outside, but it looked like a man." "You didn't go out and take a look?" "Why would I?" Joey asked, his eyes narrowing. "Your dad used to tell me you liked to go out in the woods by yourself." Yeah, I do that sometimes, but I didn't last night." "Are you sure?" Rick pressed. "You went out a few nights ago, didn't you? The night your mom—" "Do we have to do this?" MaryAnne interrupted. "He told you what he saw last night." Rick hesitated, then decided that for now he'd gone far enough. But at the funeral, he would watch Joey very carefully. He could never tell when the boy was lying. MaryAnne stood in the graveyard on the edge of Sugarloaf, Allison and Logan on one side of her, Joey on the other. Her eyes were fixed on the twin coffins at the edges of the open grave. For Joey's sake, she mustn't give in to the terrible sense of loss that had overwhelmed her late last night. Long after everyone had gone to bed, she had retreated to the den and had had herself a good cry. Today, though, there would be no tears. MaryAnne automatically reached down to take Joey's hand as the minister began the first prayer. She squeezed his hand reassuringly, but if Joey was aware of the pressure, he gave no sign. Shock, MaryAnne told herself. He's still in shock. And yet, though she tried not to let it, another thought came. It's almost as if he doesn't care. Her eyes flickered over the crowd. She found the deputy standing almost directly opposite her. His eyes were fastened on Joey, his frown reflecting his own suspicions. Indeed, as she scanned the crowd now, she imagined that everyone there was gazing at Joey with veiled eyes, their suspicions of him barely concealed. Even a couple of children his own age, a boy and girl MaryAnne was certain had to be twins, were staring at Joey. Joey's hand suddenly tightened in MaryAnne's. Startled, she looked down to see Joey staring off into the distance. Following his gaze, she thought she could distinguish the figure of a man in the trees at the edge of the graveyard. A large, hulking man with wild-looking hair, a full beard, and ill-fitting clothes. She looked again, but the figure was gone. Shaken, she wasn't quite sure she'd seen it at all. MaryAnne went to bed early that night, but sometime near midnight she woke up suddenly with the feeling that something was wrong. She got out of bed, slipped into her bathrobe, and left her room. Moving to Allison's door, she opened it a crack and peeked inside. Allison was asleep. She went on to Logan's room. Her son was also sound asleep. Finally, she hesitated at Joey's door, then looked inside. Joey's bed covers were thrown back. The room was empty. Oh, God! MaryAnne hurried to the window. She scanned the yard and the field. Then a movement caught her eye, and she turned to look at the barn. One of its great doors was open, swinging in the wind. What was he doing out there? Hurrying downstairs, MaryAnne left the house and ran to the barn. Inside, the horses were whinnying, nervously. "Joey?" she called as she stepped through the open door. "Joey, are you out here?" She listened and heard a low sound, unidentifiable, from the far end of the barn. "Joey?" The sound swelled into a snarl, and suddenly something came charging out of the blackness toward her. MaryAnne jerked back, slamming the door shut and dropping the bar into place just as something hurled itself against the other side. Her heart pounding, she fled back across the yard, slamming the kitchen door shut as soon as she was inside. What was it? What had been in the barn? Storm wouldn't have attacked her. And it couldn't have been Joey. It couldn't have been. Her pulse slowly returning to normal. She checked the living room and den. She was about to dial the sheriff's office when she heard the kitchen door open. Was it possible whatever was in the barn was now in the house? "Joey," she stammered. But a moment later, Storm threw himself on her as he tried to lick her face. A second later, Joey himself appeared, dressed in jeans. "Joey, where were you?" Joey's eyes darkened. "Storm and I went for a walk." "Didn't you hear me when I called you in the barn?" Joey frowned. "I wasn't in the barn." Now it was MaryAnne's turn to frown. "But I was just out there, Joey. Something was inside. It came at me." Joey stared at her. "Well, there isn't anything out there now. I stopped to check. Everything's fine." With Storm at his heels, Joey trotted up the stairs. MaryAnne heard his door close. It was a long time before MaryAnne fell asleep that night. She still had the uneasy feeling that someone was out there watching and waiting. Until now, all of MaryAnne's energies had been depleted by grief over the loss of her closest friend, and by the demands of dealing with the double funeral as well. But it was over now, and after spending yesterday hiking the ranch with the children, today she would begin finding out just what was involved in running the ranch. When she'd seen Bill Sykes the night before, she'd gone out to ask him to come to the house this morning. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She waved Sykes in, pouring him a mug of coffee. "Did you have a good night?" she asked. Bill Sykes shrugged. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "I'm probably going to be quitting." MaryAnne froze. Quitting? But he couldn't do that. And then a thought came to her. He was testing her. "I see. Well, why don't we talk about it? Perhaps we can work something out." "Just doesn't seem right anymore, that's all." His eyes avoiding hers. "You mean because of what happened to Ted and Audrey?" It's not just that. It's something else, too. I just don't believe what happened to Mr. and Mrs. Wilkenson was an accident. Something spooked that horse so as it kicked Mr. W., and something gave Mrs. W. enough of a scare that she lost her balance." MaryAnne felt her pulse quicken. "Have you talked to Rick Martin about this?" "Oh, yeah, he's been up to see me twice now." His eyes met hers. "Something's going on around here lately." Sykes looked away. "Something's out there, and it's starting to make me pretty nervous." "Joey was out night before last," MaryAnne said softly. But Sykes shook his head. "It's not him. Saw him myself. Besides, the horses wouldn't spook just 'cause he was around." MaryAnne kept her eyes on Sykes.
But there was something in the barn that night. It snarled, then it came at me. I slammed the door just before it got to me. I ain't saying there wasn't, Sykes replied. I heard the horses, too. But when I checked the barn, there weren't nothing there, just the horses. Nervous, as if a grizzly was skulking around. What about a man? MaryAnne suggested. Joey thinks he saw... She cut her words short as Joey himself came into the room. Sykes stood up. Maybe you and me better talk later on, he said. Before MaryAnne could reply, he was gone. What was he doing in here? Joey demanded as soon as the door had slammed shut. We were having a talk, she said. Is there something wrong with that? Joey's expression darkened. He shouldn't be in here. Dad was going to fire him. Fire him? Why? Joey gazed steadily at her, and his voice was cold. Because he's crazy. He makes up stories. I bet he's even making up stories that I did something to Mom and Dad. Joey went out the back door. Stunned, MaryAnne made no move to stop him. All she knew was that Joey seemed nothing like the boy who had thrown himself into her arms when she'd arrived. This Joey seemed completely different. Suddenly MaryAnne had an uneasy feeling that there was a dark facet to Joey's personality, a darkness she was just beginning to see. Can we go into town, Mom? MaryAnne was sitting at the desk in the den as she tried to familiarize herself with the ranch's accounting system. She glanced up at Allison. I'm not sure I have the time right now. You don't have to take us, Allison told her. We can walk. It'll just be like going on a hike. MaryAnne remembered Joey and his strange behavior. Honey, have you noticed anything different about Joey this morning? Allison looked guarded. Different? What do you mean? Then Joey himself stepped into the doorway, his dark eyes exhibiting nothing of the chill MaryAnne had seen in them before. Can I take Allison and Logan into town, please? MaryAnne studied the boy carefully. Once again, he was the appealing 13-year-old she'd come to know. Whatever had happened this morning, she decided must have been blown out of proportion in her own mind. Well, I don't see why not, she decided. What time will you be back? Joey shrugged. 3 or 4. Fine. But if you're going to be later, call me, okay? By the time the kids were gone, MaryAnne's attention was once more focused on the account books. Where shall we start? Allison asked as they came into the center of the little town. The shopping district occupied only 2 blocks. The Mercantile, Joey told her. You guys like Western clothes? I do, Logan instantly declared. Holding Joey's hand, he started down the wooden sidewalk, with Allison scurrying to catch up. In the next block, she could see the sign identifying Sugarloaf Mercantile. As they approached it, several boys and girls about her own age came out. They turned toward her, but then stopped, looked at each other, and then headed across the street. Joey's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. Just some kids. They don't like me, that's all. How come? Allison blurted. Joey's face reddened. They just don't. Come on. He pushed the door of the Mercantile open and went inside, with Logan behind him. But Allison hesitated, gazing where the group of kids was standing, whispering among themselves and sneaking glances in her direction. What was it, she wondered. Why wouldn't they like Joey? What could he possibly have done to them? Allison, she heard Logan calling. Come on. Turning away, Allison hurried into the store. In the middle of the afternoon, MaryAnne closed the last of the ledgers. She had done it. She had gone over all the accounts and had slowly come to understand just how much it cost to run the ranch. But no matter how much money the ranch absorbed, the books showed clearly that Ted's income was large enough to support it all. Her understanding of the Wilkensons' financial structure had become clearer. I can do it, she decided, at least this part of it. She got up from the desk, stretched. Exercise, that's what she needed. Maybe she should go for a long walk. She was about to start off when a loud whinnying came from the barn. Then from the house she heard another sound, a dog barking. Hurrying up to the second floor, she opened the door to Joey's room. Storm immediately bounded out, racing down the stairs. MaryAnne followed him, catching up to him in the kitchen where the closed door had stopped him. As soon as she opened it, he streaked across to the barn, disappearing inside.
By the time MaryAnne made it to the barn, the horses had begun calming down, but still, she stopped at the door. "Storm! Here, boy." A second later, the dog trotted up to her, his tail wagging. "What is it, boy?" The horses were quiet now. MaryAnne finally stepped into the barn. "Bill? Are you here?" Nothing. With Storm at her heels, she moved further into the barn. The 3 horses were in their stalls, watching her. Sheikah nickered softly, her ears flicking forward. The big mare had finally come back the day after MaryAnne had arrived. The memory of that day came back to her. She had had to call the sheriff, of course. Within the hour, Rick's deputy, Tony Molino, had arrived with Olivia Sherborne, the local veterinarian. While the vet had examined the horse, Joey had pleaded with the deputy not to have her destroyed. Tony had said nothing until Olivia finished her inspection. "Well, what do you think?" Olivia had met the deputy's gaze with a determined look.
"I think putting this horse down is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. I've never known she could have hurt anything."
The deputy had spread his hands in submission. "All right, Olivia, you're the expert." Olivia had walked back to her truck, calling to MaryAnne.
"You have any trouble with him, you call me. I live just down the road."
Then she'd driven away, leaving Tony chuckling. The horse nickered again, bringing MaryAnne out of her reverie. "I think Dr. Sherborne was right," MaryAnne said aloud as she patted the horse.
"Damn right I was," a voice said from the barn door. "And my name's Olivia."
MaryAnne spun around to see the vet. "Oh, my God, you startled me." Olivia strode into the barn, then stopped in front of Sheikah.
"Thought I'd stop by and see how my girl's getting along."
She held the big mare's head in her hand. Satisfied, the vet turned to face MaryAnne.
"I assume you're not having any problems since you haven't called me."
"Actually, I'm barely getting used to the place." Then, remembering her conversation with Sykes, she found herself telling Olivia about it. "I'm not sure what to do. Was Ted really about to fire Bill?"
"Not that I know of. But if Sykes wants to go, let him. Plenty of people to take his job and do it better. If this were my place, I'd do things differently."
MaryAnne frowned. "What's wrong with it?" Olivia hesitated.
"Well, now, you put me on the spot here. It's just a feeling I had lately that something's not quite right around here. For one thing, there are all kinds of strange people coming and going, even a few mountain men."
"Mountain men?"
"Nutcases. For the most part, they're pretty harmless."
Unbidden, into MaryAnne's mind came the memory of the strange-looking man she'd seen at Ted and Audrey's funeral. "Do any of them live around here?"
"Who knows?" Olivia replied.
Then, seeing the look of worry that came over MaryAnne's face, the veterinarian quickly regretted her words.
"Oh, hell, don't you worry now. I'm sure everything's just fine."
After she had checked the other 2 horses and she and MaryAnne had settled on the front porch, Olivia looked at the barn.
"When you get right down to it, I'm not sure you need a full-time handyman. If you decide to get rid of Sykes, I can always lend you a hand if you need it."
I couldn't possibly ask." Olivia silenced her with a gesture.
"Don't you tell me what you could ask and what you couldn't. We're neighbors. Besides, if it weren't for Audrey, I wouldn't have moved up here at all."
"You mean you knew her before? Before you came here?" Olivia nodded.
We were friends in Sun Valley. I'm not certain we had much in common, except both of us were nursing broken romances. When Audrey married Ted a month after she met him, I told her she was on the rebound and she hardly knew Ted. You name it, I said it."
MaryAnne chuckled ruefully. "I guess I told her all the same things. But she proved us wrong, didn't she?" Olivia nodded.
"She sure did. Anyway, it got so I was driving up here to see him practically every weekend, so finally I just moved."
She fell into a pensive silence. When she spoke again, her voice was low.
"You remember earlier I said that lately there's been something about this place that hasn't seemed quite right?"
MaryAnne nodded.
"Well, there has got to be a reason why the animals are spooking, and we had better find out what it is. The next time it happens, you call me, okay?"
"Okay." Then, as MaryAnne walked Olivia out to the truck, Could I ask you a question, Olivia, about Ted and Joey? Olivia seemed to tense.
What about him?
I'm not sure. It's just that, well, I'm wondering if there was a problem between them. Olivia hesitated.
Well, I know Ted was pretty hard on Joey the last couple of years, but as far as I could tell, Ted was just trying to teach him some responsibility.
What about Audrey? Did she think Ted was too hard on Joey? Olivia shrugged.
There was a lot Audrey never talked to me about, and a lot I never asked her.
She started the engine.
Look, don't go looking for trouble. See you soon.
She drove off. MaryAnne realized what Olivia had just told her had done nothing to ease her worries. The wolf froze, its body rigid, one forepaw raised from the ground, its tail held straight out. The man stopped instantly, only his eyes moving as he found the object of the wolf's interest, a rabbit crouched in the shelter of a boulder. The man tapped the wolf. Instantly it shot forward, hurling itself on the rabbit. Seizing the creature by the neck, the wolf tore into its flesh with its sharply pointed canines. The rabbit squealed in pain, then lay still. The wolf picked it up in its mouth. The man started back toward the woods, the wolf falling in beside him. Finally coming to the shack, he dumped 3 carcasses from his backpack onto the rough-hewn table, picked up a knife, and began expertly skinning them. He cut the carcasses up, then threw most of the meat into the pot on the stove. He picked up the last leg of the beaver and tore into the raw meat with teeth almost as strong as the wolf's, the animal's flesh sharply sweet on his tongue. Tonight, the hunger was on him fully, and he knew where the hunting would be best. In his room, Joey flopped down on the bed. The feeling was happening to him again, the feeling he thought he was finally done with, but now it was back, stronger than ever. He got up from the bed and went to the window, raising it all the way so the breeze from the mountains blew into his face. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with cool air. It was fully dark now, and the feeling had been gathering ever since the sun had fallen. At dinner he had to resist the urge to run out into the night, but why? He no longer felt the need to escape from his father, for his father was dead. When he had realized he was finally safe from the beatings, Joey had been certain that the terrible feeling inside him was at last gone forever. Yet it was strong tonight, stronger than ever before. He felt restless like a caged animal. But this was his house, his room. He belonged here. Except on nights like tonight, he knew he didn't belong anywhere. Maybe it was because of those kids, the ones he'd seen in town today, the ones who hated him, even though he'd never done anything to them. Or had he? What about the times he couldn't remember? The dark urges were already beginning to take form in his mind, the urges to strike out, to pass the pain on to someone else. No, he wouldn't give in to it, not this time. Make it go away, he silently begged. Make it go away. Storm jumped up, licking the boy's cheek, but Joey was already preparing to slip out into the beckoning darkness. I keep thinking maybe we should have gone home, Tamara Reynolds said, snuggling closer in the sleeping bag to Glenn Foster. The forest surrounding the tent now seemed ominous. I mean, after what those people said. Glenn grinned. Give me a couple minutes, I'll make you forget every fear you ever had. He pressed his mouth against hers and held her closer, his excitement growing. Outside the tent, the dark figure slipped out of the forest, moving closer, twitching with anticipation. At last, giving in to the instinctive urges of its nature, it sprang. The nylon above Glenn's head split with a quick ripping sound, and the brute was upon them, slashing. "Tammy!" Glenn tried to call out, but something sharp and vicious slashed at his throat, and it was too late. By the time the attack was over, and the campsite deserted by the intruder, Glenn was dead. Tamara Reynolds, her skin torn, lay moaning softly against pain so searing she could not even cry for help. MaryAnne was back in New Jersey, in her own house. Outside she could hear sirens. They seemed to be everywhere. The sirens grew closer, and suddenly she knew what they meant. They were coming here. They were coming for her. They thought she'd killed Audrey. But she hadn't. Surely she hadn't. Suddenly the door flew open and she turned to see Joey. His hands covered with blood, an empty look in his eyes, a cold smile on his face. He stepped toward her, his bloodied hands reached out to her, coming closer and closer as the sirens grew louder. A scream rose in her throat as she jerked awake, sitting up in her bed. A dream. Oh, it was just a dream. Except that she could still hear the sound of sirens. Shaking off the last vestiges of sleep, MaryAnne got out of bed and hurried to the window. Up on the hillside she could see a silvery glow and red and blue lights flickering among the trees. What is it, Mommy?" Logan's voice asked from the hall. "It's police cars," Allison said, joining her brother, "at the campground." The sirens died away. MaryAnne pulled on her bathrobe, glancing at the clock. It was 1 a.m. What would have made the police go up to the campground at this hour? "Let's go downstairs and make a cup of cocoa," she told the children. "I'll get Joey, too." As Allison and Logan ran back to their rooms, MaryAnne tapped at Joey's door. When there was no answer, she pushed the door open. His bed was empty. She hurried downstairs, quickly checking the rooms in the faint hope that Joey might be there. He wasn't. By the time she reached the kitchen, her children were already there. "Do you know where Joey is?" Puzzled, Allison shook her head. "Isn't he in his room?" "He's not in the house at all," MaryAnne told her, starting to panic. Surely he wouldn't have gone up into the mountains. And even if he had, how could the police cars be connected to him? It couldn't have anything to do with Joey. It couldn't. But even as she tried to reassure herself, she remembered the dream from which she had just awakened, the blood dripping from Joey's outstretched hands. Taking the spotlighter off the charger mounted next to the back door, she snapped it on as she stepped out into the darkness. "Joey!" she called out. "Joey! Where are you?" Her heart pounding, MaryAnne stepped into the barn and flashed the light around. The 3 horses were lined up as usual. MaryAnne strode down the wide aisle. She found Joey in the empty stall at the far end, sound asleep. What had brought him out here? She knelt, gently touching his shoulder. "Joey!" He came awake instantly. "Joey, why are you sleeping out here? Why aren't you in bed?" It's something I do sometimes." A look of defensiveness, almost furtiveness, came into his eyes. "Sometimes I just can't sleep in the house." "I see," MaryAnne said. "Well, come on back to the house, all right?" Joey stood up. The strange feeling, the frightening nervousness that had seized him earlier, finally driving him into the darkness, was gone. Something had released him from the torment of his own mind. The whoop, whoop, whoop of the helicopter blades drew closer. Deputy Rick Martin instinctively ducked as the downdraft of the great rotor struck him. From the belly of the machine a rope was dangling. At its end hung the stretcher into which he and Tony would lift Tamara Reynolds. The stretcher began its slow descent, and Rick moved away to check on the young woman. "How's she doing?" he asked Tony. "Still got a pulse, but her breathing's getting worse." Rick glanced up at the man who had arrived in the village an hour ago to report the attack. "Hey, give us a hand." The man hurried over. The 3 of them carefully moved Tamara onto the stretcher, then placed the stretcher in the basket. Rick fastened the strap, stepped back, and waved to the pilot. The basket lifted off the ground. As they watched the chopper in its precarious climb, Rick glanced at the man who had reported the attack. "Anything else you want to tell me, Mr. Jensen? Peter Jensen? There isn't anything else to tell, really. There was this sound. I took my flashlight and came over here. When I found them, I didn't know what to do. I yelled at my wife to stay in our tent. Then I headed down to our car. Maybe that was a dumb thing to do, huh? I mean, whatever did this is still out there somewhere. But what else could I do? The woman was still alive. Why do you suppose it was this tent that got hit? Why wasn't it mine?" The same question had been running through Rick's mind, but he had no answer. Had something attracted the attacker to this particular couple? Or had it been a random attack? He didn't know. But one thing he was sure of: Coyote Creek Campground would be closed for the rest of the year, if not forever. The skies were leaden the next morning, and a steady drizzle had begun to fall. "Why do we have to go to school today?" Logan complained. "It's pouring outside and—" "Everybody's going, and you're going too," his mother told him. "Now go. or you're going to miss the bus." Logan ran to catch up with Allison and Joey, who were already disappearing around the first curve in the driveway. 50 yards further on, Joey suddenly veered off onto a path. "Where are you going?" Logan asked. "It's a shortcut," Joey explained. "Come on." Allison and Joey glanced at each other uneasily. Maybe we'd better stay on the road," she suggested. "I mean, what if we get lost?" Joey's lips twisted scornfully. "You're not chicken, are you?"
"Chicken, chicken," Logan sang out. "Allison's a chicken."
"All right, let's go," she challenged, striding off into the dripping forest. The trees closed around them, the narrow path twisting and turning. Strange sounds came at them from every direction. Allison was startled when she heard the sharp snap of a twig. "What was that?" "What?" Logan asked. "It wasn't anything," Joey replied. "Probably a deer." It came again. A sharp snap, as if a twig had broken, followed by rustling in the brush up ahead. The 3 children stared at the spot. Then they heard a voice.
"You're going to die, Joey Wilkenson."
Her heart racing, Allison pulled Logan closer. Joey, though, glanced around, then stooped to pick up a rotting stick.
"I'm coming for you, Joey. I'm going to get you."
Joey hurled the stick in the direction from which the thread had come. It struck something. A voice cried out,
"Jeez, you could have hurt me."
"Come out here," Joey challenged, his voice filled with fury. Now there was a loud rustling in the bushes, and a moment later 2 children pushed their way through to the trail. The boy was glaring angrily at Joey and rubbing his shoulder.
"You're really nuts, Joey."
Joey's jaw set, his eyes glittering furiously. "If I'd wanted to hurt you, I would have," he declared. The girl's eyes rolled heavenward in scorn.
"You almost threw one of your fits, creep."
Then she gazed quizzically at Allison.
"You're Allison Carpenter, aren't you? And he's your brother."
Allison managed to nod.
"I'm Andrea Stiffel, and this is my brother, Mike. We're twins. We live up that way."
She gestured toward the north. Logan suddenly piped up. "How come you were trying to scare us?" Andrea Stiffel's eyes mocked him.
"'Cause we figured after what happened last night, it would be easy, and it worked, didn't it?"
"After what happened last night?" Allison asked. Andrea and Michael glanced at each other, then both started talking at once.
"Some guy got killed up at Coyote Creek," Michael began. "They had to fly the woman down to Boise," Andrea chimed in.
"But what was it?" Allison asked. "What attacked them?"
Michael Stiffel shrugged. "No one knows. It might have been a bear."
His voice dropped mysteriously and his eyes fixed on Logan.
"Or it might have been a Sasquatch,"
raising his arms so he loomed over Logan.
What's a Sasquatch?" "No one's ever seen one up close," Andrea said, instantly picking up the story. "But they live up in the mountains, and they're 7 feet tall."
Logan shuddered.
"It's not true."
"Is it?" "It's just a story, Logan," Allison assured him.
"Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't," Michael teased. Then he called it, "Hey, Joey, was it a Sasquatch, or was it you?"
Joey's face flushed scarlet, but he said nothing, only shooting Michael Stiffel a dark glare. Michael snickered and nudged his sister. Allison's mind whirled. Was Michael kidding? He had to be. What had Joey ever done to them? They came out onto the road. The school bus was pulling up. Michael and Andrea both broke into a run, each wanting to be the first to tell about the gory events at the campground. Allison and Logan fell in beside Joey. They, too, got onto the bus and were greeted by laughter from the kids at the back. Every one of them, Allison noticed, was staring at Joey. Feeling suddenly protective of the boy, Allison slipped her hand into Joey's. For the rest of the ride, they sat close together, their hands entwined, pretending they didn't hear the whispers. Maybe I should have stayed home, MaryAnne thought. She was sitting in the front seat of Olivia's pickup as the vehicle bounced up the rutted road to Coyote Creek Campground. As Olivia maneuvered the truck, MaryAnne's thoughts spun out of control. A man had died horribly in the campground last night, and the woman with him was in intensive care, and ever since Olivia had told her, MaryAnne had been unable to reject the nagging idea that the attacks were somehow connected to the deaths of Audrey and Ted. When Olivia had arrived, she said,
I'm going up to the campground. Rick asked me to help look for tracks. It struck me you might be feeling weird with no one around except Bill Sykes."
MaryAnne nodded. She didn't want to be alone in the house. Now they had reached the campground. Glenn Foster's body was just being removed. Olivia strode toward the clump of men. MaryAnne turned away, trying not to look at the wounds the man had suffered. Olivia slipped into a space between Rick Martin and Whit Baker, the county coroner.
"No tooth marks," she observed.
The corpse lay face down, its back deeply lacerated by claw marks. The throat, too, had been laid open.
"That's what's bothering me," Whit agreed. "I've never seen an animal attack where there weren't any signs of bites."
Olivia bent closer, examining the lacerations.
"You ever seen anything like this before, Rick?"
The deputy shook his head.
"Sure looks like claws did it, but what kind? Spacing's not right for a bear."
"Cougar?" Whit suggested.
Olivia said, "If it were a cougar, the lacerations would be deeper. And look at this. Doesn't this look like a bruise?"
Whit agreed. "Almost like someone squeezed his shoulder. But those aren't fingernail scratches."
"What about the tent?" Olivia asked.
"Come and take a look." Then Rick nodded to the two medics, and they slid the gurney into the ambulance. With its departure, MaryAnne finally trusted herself to join Olivia, Rick, and the coroner.
"This is weird,"
she heard Rick say as she joined the group around the tent.
"It's as if someone tore the netting at the back window, then ripped the nylon open."
"So, at least we know it was a man," Baker commented. "An animal wouldn't know to start at the window."
"Except, nylon's tough," Rick told him. "You don't just give it a rip. You got any idea what kind of strength it would take to do that?"
Baker shook his head. "More than any man I've ever met has." "I saw someone," MaryAnne heard herself saying, "at the funeral. A man standing way off to the side. He was big, and looked terribly strong and sort of, well, wild." She turned to Olivia. "Like one of those mountain men you were telling me about."
"Mountain man?" Rick said doubtfully.
"He was staring at Joey, and then he was gone."
"Well, that puts a new twist on all this," Rick said. "Assuming, of course, that there's a connection between whoever you saw and what's been going on up here."
As a crew began packing up anything that could possibly be evidence, Olivia moved carefully around the campsite, searching for tracks. MaryAnne felt a chill of fear slowly move through her body. Someone living up here in the mountains. Someone who attacked like a wild animal. Where and when would he strike next? Rick stepped into the room where Tamara lay wrapped in bandages. Her arm was attached to an IV bottle. Her eyes flickered open.
"Miss Reynolds, can you tell me what happened?"
"Don't know. Big. Hairy.
Could it have been a bear?"
Not a bear. Not big enough."
"But you did see it," Rick pressed.
The woman nodded. Rick repeated the description of the man MaryAnne had seen at the funeral.
"Maybe. It's too dark."
Rick's heart sank. Without a detailed description, neither he nor anyone else would have any idea of what they were looking for. All he knew was that it was probably as large as a man, very strong, and very dangerous. Mortally dangerous. By the time the school bus dropped them off that afternoon, the rain had stopped. As Andrea and Michael Stiffel disappeared up the driveway leading to their house, Storm came bounding down the road to greet his master. Joey knelt down to hug the dog, then pointed up to Coyote Creek Campground.
"Let's take a look," he said,
starting up the trail. Allison shivered and hung back, but Logan dashed after Joey.
"Wait up, Joey, I'm coming."
Allison hesitated, but in the end she, too, started up the road to the campground. Upon seeing the murder site, though, she changed her mind.
I think we should go home. I don't like it here."
Storm barked excitedly, then moved away, his nose pressed to the ground.
"Where's he going, Joey?"
Logan asked.
"He's found something. He found a scent, and he's following it. Come on!"
Joey darted after the big dog, already moving into the forest. Logan gazed up at his sister.
What should we do?
Allison glanced around nervously.
Let's just go home.
He sat on the single rough chair in his cabin, the wolf sprawled beside him. He'd awakened an hour ago, having slept fitfully through the day. Soon the long winter months would descend on him. This winter would be his last. Somehow he knew that by spring he would be gone. But not now. Not yet. The wolf stirred, then sat up, a low, warning growl rising in her throat. The man stiffened, his senses sharpening, alert for the noise that had disturbed the animal. Then he heard it. Something moved up the rocky path toward the cabin. The man sniffed at the air. There it was, the scent. And beyond what he heard and smelled, a sense deep within him told him that the boy was near, the boy who belonged to him. Now the wolf, too, was on her feet, ready to leap at whatever intruder was approaching. The man's hand dropped to the wolf's head, silencing the menacing snarl. Joey froze when he stepped into the clearing, his eyes locking on those of the wolf. His eyes finally rose to the tall figure who stood just outside the cabin door. Their eyes met. Their gazes held. After a long moment, Joey started across the clearing toward the man and the wolf. He was pulled toward them, as if by some unseen magnet. Closer. Closer. Until Joey felt the large, cold hand on his cheek. "5:05. MaryAnne got up from the desk where she'd been trying to concentrate on the papers Charlie had given her. She saw Allison coming down from her room, Logan following her. "Hasn't he come home yet?" Allison asked. "No, he hasn't," she replied, keeping her voice calm. A few minutes later, Logan cried out from his post by the kitchen door.
"There he is! He's coming across the field!"
MaryAnne hurried to the door. When Joey came into the house, his happy grin faded at the look on her face. "I think you had better explain yourself, young man. You have been gone 2 hours. Joey's expression hardened. "So what?" he demanded. "Mom always let me—" "I don't care what your mother let you do," MaryAnne cut in. "She's not here anymore, and I'm responsible for you now. I'm your guardian, and I'm telling you—" But Joey was no longer listening.
"I don't need a guardian," he said. "Why don't you just go away?"
Before MaryAnne could stop him, he was out the door again, Storm at his heels. 10 o'clock. Joey finally stepped out of the woods. For hours he'd been watching as his godmother came outside over and over, calling him. Why should he go back to the house? All she'd do was yell at him again. And he hadn't done anything wrong. All he and Storm had done was go for a hike. The thing was, he couldn't tell Aunt MaryAnne where he'd been, because he didn't really know. All he knew was that Storm had led him up the mountainside, higher than he'd ever gone before. After a while, he'd started getting that weird feeling again, but he'd kept going, and by the time the feeling passed, he wasn't anywhere near where he'd started, and it had gotten a lot later. As the cold of the night seeped through his body, the last of Joey's anger faded away. Drawn by the warmth of the house, he started across the field, Storm racing ahead of him. The back door was open, and his godmother was calling, "Joey, are you all right?" He hesitated, but when he heard no anger in her voice, he dashed across the yard, hurling himself in her arms. "I'm sorry, Aunt MaryAnne." "And I'm sorry, too," she assured him. "You and I just have to learn how to talk to each other, okay?" Nodding, Joey let MaryAnne lead him into the kitchen. I didn't mean to get so mad, But he was unable to explain his anger any more than he could account for the time he'd lost in the mountains. "We'll just forget about it, all right? Would you like some supper?" Joey shook his head. "I'm not hungry. I better go get cleaned up." As Joey left the kitchen, MaryAnne called her closest neighbor once more, this time to report that Joey was back. "I'm glad," Margaret Stiffield told her. "And I hope it doesn't mean he's starting to have trouble again." MaryAnne's breath caught in her throat. "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" Margaret finally replied guardedly, "Well, it's really none of my business. I'm sure Joey's just fine now. Thanks for calling." Before MaryAnne could say anything else, Margaret hung up. Pensively, MaryAnne went upstairs to Allison's room. Studying her daughter's expression closely, she said, "Allison, I just talked to Mrs. Stiffel, and she said something strange about Joey." As Allison averted her face, MaryAnne frowned. "Do you know what she's talking about? Has someone else said something?" "It's not like anyone really said anything," Allison began. "It's sort of, well, everyone acts as if they don't like Joey. They all act real weird, like Joey's done something to them, but nobody ever says what." For a long time that night, MaryAnne lay awake thinking. What could Mrs. Stiffel have meant? What trouble was she talking about? Somehow MaryAnne knew she was going to find out. As midnight gave way to the small hours of the morning, the wind rattled the open windows of Joey's room. Waking, he slid out of bed and padded silently down to the kitchen. He moved to the refrigerator. Opening it, he found what he was looking for. 6 steaks, stacked neatly on a large plate. His stomach screaming with hunger, he snatched up one of the steaks and sank his teeth into it, tearing away a piece, swallowing it almost before he had a chance to chew it.
"Joey, what are you doing?"
As the kitchen lights came on, he recognized Logan staring curiously at him.
"You can't eat that. It's not even cooked."
"I'm not doing anything," Joey replied, thrusting his hands behind his back. MaryAnne herself appeared. "Joey? Logan? Why aren't you two in bed?" Logan pointed accusingly at Joey.
"He's got a steak, and he's eating it raw."
Her eyes widening in shock, MaryAnne stared at Joey.
I wasn't eating it. I was hungry, and I found it in the refrigerator. I was going to cook it, but I'm not sure how."
The misery on the boy's face wrenched at MaryAnne. "Okay, let me get Logan back to bed, and then I'll fry it up for you, all right?" Joey nodded, and MaryAnne followed Logan up the stairs. The second she was gone, Joey's attention returned to the raw meat in his hand. Tearing at it with his teeth, he began cramming it into his mouth, swallowing all of it in less than a minute. By the time MaryAnne had gotten Logan settled back in bed, Joey had washed the blood from his hands and face. MaryAnne stepped into the kitchen. Joey turned to face her. "I changed my mind. I just drank some milk." MaryAnne frowned uncertainly. "You're sure that's all you want?" Joey nodded and darted up the stairs. MaryAnne reached for the light switch, but suddenly paused, her eyes on the refrigerator. Feeling faintly silly, she opened the refrigerator door. She counted the steaks on the plate. Earlier, there had been 6. She was certain of it. Now, there were only 5. When she finally turned off the lights and started back up the stairs, her mind was spinning. She would get no more sleep tonight. Obviously, she was living with a boy she didn't know. "Going to be an early winter," Bill Sykes commented, glancing up at the sky. "Are you still thinking of leaving?" MaryAnne asked.
"Well, now, seems to me like it wouldn't be right for me to take off if you're planning to stick with it."
He glanced at her.
"That's what you're planning, isn't it?"
"I think so." She paused. Then, "Bill, what can you tell me about Joey? He doesn't seem to have many friends."
"Joey's a loner."
Sykes looked out over the field.
"Nothing wrong with that."
"But why? Allison says the other kids don't seem to like Joey." Sykes turned to face MaryAnne.
"Far as I can see, there's 2 kinds of people in the world. The ones that get along with other people, and the ones that get along with animals. Joey gets along with animals. Nothing wrong with that."
An hour later, as she headed toward town, MaryAnne considered what Sykes had told her. Could that really be all there was to Joey's lack of friendships? By the time she pulled up to the school, MaryAnne was wondering if she really needed to talk to anyone there, but, well, since she was already here. She found her way to the principal's office, where Florence Wickman was waiting for her. "I'm glad you called this morning." The principal ushered MaryAnne into her office. "I was going to call you." Is there a problem with one of my children?" "Oh, no, not at all. But I wondered how much you might know about Joey's, Mrs. Wickman paused. "Well, I suppose problems are the best way to put it." MaryAnne's heart sank. My daughter tells me that a lot of the children don't like Joey, but I don't know why. Mrs. Wickman picked up a folder and handed it to MaryAnne. I think it's all in there. He tends to daydream a lot, just sits staring out the window. She leaned forward in her chair. And, there were the fights. Fights? I always wondered if the fact that Joey invariably wound up fighting bigger, older boys wasn't some way of striking out at his father. Are you saying that Ted was an abusive father? MaryAnne asked. Oh, I'm just searching for an explanation. At any rate, you know what they say, forewarned is forearmed. MaryAnne rose and slowly walked to the door. Thank you, she said automatically. As she stepped out of the principal's office, MaryAnne didn't notice Joey standing at the end of the hall, standing silently staring at her. She'd been talking to Mrs. Wickman about him, spying on him. Rick stared at the report from the lab in Boise in disgust. Grabbing the phone, he jabbed angrily at the keypad. Hank, this is Rick Martin up in Sugarloaf. I'm looking at your report on that stuff we sent you. What the hell do you mean, unidentified animal hair? It means the hairs we recovered were animal, and that we don't know what kind they are. The closest thing is wolf, but it's too thin and too curly. All right. So where does that leave us? Rick knew the editor of the paper would be nosing around in no time. Unidentified animal sounds awfully close to Sasquatch to me, and the last thing this place needs is for the tabloids to pick up something like that. In his office in Boise, Hank Henry shrugged. Stonewall it, he suggested, and hung up. Rick decided that for now, he'd say nothing at all about the strange report he'd gotten. After all, there was no sense causing a panic. Out back of her house, Olivia took the shotgun out of MaryAnne's hands and began reloading the magazine. Okay, you're doing fine. She'd gone over the shotgun carefully, showing MaryAnne each of its parts and how it worked. Understand? She concluded. MaryAnne had nodded. Better. Once more. Again, she sighted along the barrel and fired. Bullseye! Olivia smiled. Not bad. He had been asleep in his cabin when the first shot had roused him. By the time the third shot was fired, he was moving quickly until he came to one of the massive outcroppings that commanded a view of the entire valley. Crouching in a shadowed cleft, he gazed out, his eyes searching out the source of the gunfire. Only when he saw the two women turn did the man stand and watch as they headed back toward the house. If she was learning how to use a gun, he would have to be more careful. You know what you need? Olivia asked as they stepped into her kitchen. An evening out in the company of adults. MaryAnne raised an eyebrow. And how do I arrange that? All you do is come down here about 6:30 this evening. I'm having a few people in. What am I going to do with the kids? Come on, MaryAnne. Allison's old enough to be babysitting herself, and Joey's the same age. Let them sit Logan and tell Sykes to keep an eye on them. You're not going to be that far from home. You're on, MaryAnne agreed as she realized just how much the idea appealed to her. As she started back up the road to El Monte, MaryAnne's enthusiasm drained, for she suddenly had the uncanny feeling that she was being watched. Parking in front of the house, she got out, glanced around, then decided she was being silly. Determinedly shaking off the feeling, she went into the house, unaware that from far up the mountainside she was indeed being watched. Watched by a man and a wolf. All afternoon the sky had grown steadily darker, and when night finally fell over the ranch, the heavy blackness set Allison's nerves on edge. Maybe she shouldn't have been so quick to insist her mother go to Dr. Sherborne's for dinner. The only sound she'd heard was the howl of what Joey had insisted was a wolf. Twice already she had to resist the urge to call her mother and beg her to come home. She kept getting the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was outside, concealed in the night, watching the house, watching them. At least once she was certain she'd seen a flash of movement just outside the window. When she turned to look straight at it, it was gone. If it had been there at all. "There's nothing there," she told herself. Then why was she so nervous? "Where's Joey?" she asked. Logan stared at the television screen. "I don't know." Allison frowned. Finally, she left the den in search of Joey. Coming to the top of the stairs, she saw light spilling from under Joey's door. She knocked. When there was no answer, she peeked in. Joey was sitting on his bed, his face pale. At last he spoke in a cold, flat voice. "I hate her. She's spying on me, and I hate her." "Who?" Allison finally asked. "Who's spying on you, Joey?"
"Aunt MaryAnne. I saw her coming out of Mrs. Wickman's office."
His words made no sense to Allison. "Joey, did something happen? How come you're mad all of a sudden?" Joey's hands clenched in his lap.
"Why shouldn't I be mad after what she did?"
"How do you know she did anything? Maybe she wanted to talk about Logan or me." Joey glared at Allison, every nerve in his body shrieking with the horrible feeling that had come over him half an hour ago. At first he'd tried to ignore it, but it just kept getting worse. He kept looking toward the window, feeling something outside, something that was calling to him. He wanted to go out there, out into the night, out where he'd be free. Now, as he stared at Allison, he felt a new fury boiling up inside him, a fury toward her.
What was she doing here? Why didn't she just go away and leave him alone? "I wish you'd go away," his eyes blazing. "I hate all of you."
Suddenly he leaped off the bed, hurling himself toward Allison, his hands reaching out for her throat. Instinctively, Allison raised her arms against his attack, a scream building in her lungs. As she lost her balance, her knee came up, catching Joey's groin as he lurched toward her. Groaning, Joey stumbled backward, and Allison raced down the stairs. There was a loud banging at the kitchen door. Sobbing, she jerked open the door, then gasped at the sight of a man with a shotgun.
"It's okay," Sykes told her. "It's just me. What's going on?"
Allison shook her head helplessly.
"Joey, upstairs. He was acting, I don't know, it's like he went crazy."
"Call your mom. Tell her to come home. I'll go see what's going on with Joey." Leaving his gun by the kitchen door, Sykes stamped up the stairs, having no idea what to expect. What he found was an empty room. Both Joey and Storm were gone. The bedroom window stood wide open. Cursing under his breath, Sykes raced back down the stairs, grabbed his shotgun, and started after Joey. Rick was just about to let the dog out when the scanner in the kitchen came alive and he heard Debbie's voice, the dispatcher from the sheriff's department.
"Unit 72, Sugarloaf. I have a report of a missing child at El Monte Ranch. Please investigate."
Rick switched on his radio.
"Dispatch, this is Unit 71, Sugarloaf. I'll take that call also. 72, are you copying?"
"I'm already on my way, Rick," Tony replied. "Any idea what's going on?"
"I know I don't like it,"
Rick told him, remembering the strange lab report.
"Call Frank Peters. Have him bring his hounds up. Who's missing, Debbie?"
"Joseph Wilkenson," she replied. "Age 13, about 5 feet tall, brown hair."
"I know what Joey looks like," Rick cut in. "I'll see you up there, Tony."
He began changing back into his uniform. Not bothering with lights or siren, Rick sped to El Monte. Olivia opened the door.
"Everyone's in the kitchen."
MaryAnne, her face pale, was sitting between her two children. Across from her, taking notes, was Tony. He filled his partner in on what had happened.
"Has anyone checked Sykes' cabin?" Rick asked.
"I checked," Olivia replied.
"No one's there."
Frank Peters arrived, his 2 bloodhounds barking from the back of his pickup. Rick began organizing the search. He only prayed they would find the boy and the caretaker still alive. Bill Sykes moved steadily up the twisting trail, his breath starting to become labored. He'd been away from the house for at least a half an hour, maybe more, and most of the tracking had been uphill. And yet he wasn't even to the timberline yet. Far beyond him, the thick forest of pines still climbed steadily upward. Could Joey be up there somewhere, moving through the trees? Joey! Silence. Joey! Where are you? Suddenly, he stiffened. Had he heard something? He froze, holding his breath once more, straining his ears. Sykes was suddenly sure he was no longer alone. Something was out there in the darkness, watching him. Now as he moved, he could hear something else moving too. Off to the right, he could make out faint rustling, a sound that stopped abruptly after he himself stopped moving. Silently dropping to his knees, he raised the gun to his shoulder, aimed to the right, and pulled the trigger. The attack came from the left, just as the gun fired. The gun flew out of Sykes' hands as something pounced on him, its weight flattening him to the ground. An instinctive scream rose inside him, cut off, before a sound escaped his lips, for his larynx was torn from his throat. Sykes died without uttering his final scream of terror. The single report echoed back and forth across the valley. Frank reached down and unsnapped the leashes that held his bloodhounds in check. Giving them one last whiff of the shirt from Joey's room, he spoke sharply. Go get him! Go! Baying, the hounds raced ahead. Frank, followed by Rick, Tony, and Olivia, continued climbing up the trail. A few minutes later, the baying changed to an excited barking. Let's go, Frank said. They've got something! It took them nearly 10 minutes to catch up with the dogs. When they did, what they found was the body of Bill Sykes, his head twisted at an odd angle, connected to his body only by a few ligaments and torn muscles. Whatever was roaming the mountains above Sugarloaf had just struck again. Okay, Rick Martin sighed. I don't want Sykes's body moved. Nothing. If there are any clues about what happened up here, I want them exactly in place for the guys from Boise tomorrow morning. Tony, how do you feel about staying up all night again? Molino shrugged. I survived the other night. Guess I'll make it through tonight, too. Okay, build a fire and watch your ass. He shifted his attention to Frank Peters. Any chance of getting your dogs back on the scent? Peters spread his hands helplessly. I can try. But the hounds failed to pick up Joey Wilkenson's scent. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the blackness of the night. The light of the rising sun crept down the rugged slopes of the mountains, diffused by the leaden sky. Joey snuggled deeper into the bed. But something was wrong. Instead of the soft comforter, he felt something rough in his fingers. He came instantly awake. Joey sat up, and the animal hide with which he had been covered fell away. Where was he? Why wasn't he at home? He tried to remember what had happened last night, and finally it began to come back to him. The feeling had come on him last night. The terrible, nervous feeling. The urge to run out into the night. He'd started wondering if this time he was actually going to go crazy. They'd lock him up. They would put him in a hospital and never let him out again. Finally, the turmoil had congealed into rage, and he yelled at Aunt MaryAnne when she came looking for him. No. It had been Allison, not his godmother. He struggled to remember. Allison had come to his room. He remembered staring at her, hating her. Hating Allison? But that was crazy. He didn't hate Allison. He liked her more than anyone he'd ever met. Yesterday morning, when she'd taken his hand, he'd felt wonderful. But last night he'd said things to her, terrible things. He had gotten off the bed and he'd... Oh, jeez. He'd attacked Allison. He'd run at her to put his hands around her neck to squeeze and keep squeezing. He'd tried to kill her, but she'd gotten away from him. All he remembered was a terrible, searing pain, and then he'd been outside, running. But now where was he? He went to the open door and peered out. He frowned. The clearing looked familiar. When he turned to look at the crumbling cabin in which he had passed the night, he had the certain feeling he'd been here before. When? Suddenly he knew. Day before yesterday. When he had gone up to the Coyote Creek campground with Allison and Logan. Storm had smelled something and gone after it, and he'd followed. When he had gotten home, it was a lot later than he thought it should have been. Joey went back into the cabin and set about searching for his clothes. He finally found them piled in the corner. A strange, sharp odor filled his nose. Only when he shook them out did he suddenly understand. Dark stains covered his clothes. Blood stains. Still wet, still sticky. Where had they come from? Had he done something? Something he couldn't even remember? He must have. Seizing them, he hurried to the stove and stuffed the clothing inside. He had to get out now. With nothing to protect him except the animal skin beneath which he'd slept, he fled out the front door. He had gone a mile when he sensed something up ahead. When he sniffed the air, there was a trace of a scent, a familiar scent, the scent of blood. Through a small gap in the leaves, he could make out a man seated on the ground. A shotgun lay across his lap. The man stood up, and now Joey recognized him. Tony Molino, his uniform rumpled from his night in the woods. As Joey's eyes followed the deputy's movements, he suddenly saw the source of the pungent odor, the body that Tony must have been guarding. The body of Bill Sykes. Another image flickered in his mind, the stains on his clothes. Suddenly his heart began to pound. Could he have done this? Was it possible? He wrapped himself in the bearskin, clutching it tightly around his body. All he could think of now was his need to flee. There was a way, he realized, that he could escape it all. Another image formed in his head. An image of the cliff from which his mother had plunged less than 2 weeks ago. But could he actually do it? Could he bring himself to stand at the top of the cliff, look down and jump? MaryAnne's bones were starting to ache from exhaustion. Nearly overcome by weariness, she nevertheless refused to surrender. "Not until Joey comes home," she whispered silently to herself. "I won't go to bed. Not until Joey comes home." She knew, deep down inside her, that somewhere up in the mountains, Joey was still alive. But how had he managed to elude Frank's hounds? It was as if Joey had vanished. A flicker of movement far across the field caught her eye, and her pulse began to race. Joey! Oh, it had to be Joey. She hurried to the back door, jerking it open, only realizing as she stepped out into the yard that what she had seen wasn't Joey at all. It was Storm, standing at the edge of the forest. MaryAnne called out to him, but the dog turned and disappeared into the trees. Joey, she thought. He's got to be with Storm. He's got to be. MaryAnne was 3/4 of the way across the field when she spotted the shepherd again, pacing nervously as he watched her. As soon as she caught up with him, he started off again, moving quickly up the trail, but making certain she was following. They came to a fork, and Storm bore to the right. MaryAnne suddenly realized where this trail led, the great cliff from which Audrey had fallen to her death. Could it be that's where Joey had gone? MaryAnne pushed herself harder. Then at last she was at the top. Joey was sitting at the very edge of the cliff, his back toward her. Some kind of fur was wrapped around him. Storm, whimpering eagerly, had moved close to Joey, but the boy stared out at the valley far below. Something inside MaryAnne warned her not to startle him in any way. She started toward him, moving quietly, finally easing herself down next to him. Still saying nothing, she slowly slipped her arm around him and pulled him close. When she was sure the boy was secure in her arms, MaryAnne finally asked, "Are you all right?" Joey hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I'm not all right at all, Aunt MaryAnne. I'm scared. I wanted to die." MaryAnne pulled him closer. "I'm very glad you didn't die. Oh, Joey, we've all been very worried about you." He said nothing for a long time. Then, "I'll bet Allison wasn't worried. I bet she hates me." "Nobody hates you." "But I tried to hurt her. Aunt MaryAnne, am I crazy? Am I going to have to go to a hospital?" MaryAnne couldn't bring herself to make any promises. "Let's not worry about that right now. Come on. Let's just get you back home." With Storm leading the way, they started back down the mountain, neither of them saying a word. They had set out an hour after MaryAnne had brought Joey down from the bluff, as soon as Rick had heard his strange story of waking up in a cabin high in the mountains. Joey had led the way up the trails. They emerged into a small clearing. At the far end, Crouched against the rocky mountainside was the cabin. "See?" Joey said. "I told you it was here." Drawing his pistol, Rick started toward the sagging door. "Hello? Anybody here?" There was silence from the house. At last, Rick peered inside. "It's empty." Rick looked back at Joey. "I'm going to take a look." Joey watched as the deputy disappeared into the shack. Suddenly, Joey felt the hairs on his neck standing on end. He was no longer alone. He hesitated, then turned away from the cabin. He had gone no more than 50 yards when he saw the figure, crouched among the trees, watching him. Joey stopped, staring at the man. His hair was long, his unshaven face rough-hewn. Joey recognized him instantly. It was the same man who had been standing in the trees at his parents' funeral watching him, the man he knew, who lived in the cabin. A strange calmness came over Joey. Without thinking, he began to walk toward the man. "It's all right, Joey. You know me, don't you?" The man held out his hand. Joey hesitated, then slowly nodded. "We're alike, Joey. We've got the same blood. We're not like the others. You understand?" Joey found himself nodding. "Don't be afraid, Joey. Come." As Joey drew closer, the man reached out. Joey no longer felt alone. "Joey! Joey?" Rick's voice shattered the quiet of the moment, and Joey's eyes widened in alarm. The man dropped his hand. "Go back, Joey. It's not time yet. When it is, I'll come for you." Joey took a few tentative steps. He turned to look back, but the man was gone. Finally, Joey hurried back to the clearing. "Where were you?" Rick demanded. "Right over there." Joey gestured vaguely in the direction of the forest. "Well, don't do it again, okay?" Joey nodded, said nothing of the man he had just seen, and listened carefully as Rick laid plans to bring Frank and his bloodhounds up to the cabin. By nightfall, Rick was sure the dogs would track down the man who lived here. Forcing herself not to run out to meet them, MaryAnne waited by the door until they reached the house. She looked anxiously at Rick. "It's there," he said, "right where he said it was. I'm calling Tony and sending him up with Frank and the hounds. If the rain holds off, the dogs should be able to track the guy pretty easily." MaryAnne started to say something, then changed her mind. "Joey, why don't you go up to your room and change your clothes while I talk to Mr. Martin?" Joey gazed up at her, his eyes filled with suspicion. "Why can't I stay?" Reading the fear in his voice, MaryAnne smiled at him. "Because I want you to put on some clean clothes. We're going to see your doctor to find out what's happening to you." Joey's eyes widened. Was she going to make him go to a hospital? "I'll run away," he thought. "If they send me to a hospital, I'll run away. And go up in the mountains and find the man. He'll take care of me." Satisfied with the answer that had come to him, Joey started up the stairs. When he was gone, MaryAnne turned to Rick. "There's something I don't understand. If whoever lives in that cabin killed Bill Sykes, then why didn't he hurt Joey last night?" It was exactly the question Rick had been puzzling over, a question for which he had no answer. "Well, now, that wasn't so bad, was it, Joey?" Dr. Cochran asked. Joey shifted nervously. "You mean we're done?" Cochran nodded. "All done," he replied, as he thought of the conclusions he'd made about the boy during the last hour. Physically, the boy was in good condition. His muscular development was far beyond his years, and already hair was beginning to sprout on his chest. The only abnormality about the boy was his temperature, which measured a full degree above normal. Though he hadn't yet discovered the exact reason for Joey's memory lapses, he suspected he knew the answer. The loss of Joey's parents had been a tremendous trauma. Joey was repressing his grief. "All I need is a few minutes with your aunt to fill her in on how healthy you are." Cochran walked Joey down to the waiting room. "Would you come into my office, Mrs. Carpenter?" As Joey settled onto the sofa she vacated, MaryAnne followed the doctor, seating herself in front of his desk. Cochran dropped into his chair and picked up Joey's chart, handing it to her.
Except for a minor temperature, he remarked as MaryAnne began scanning the record. Joey's in good shape physically. For the next several minutes he spoke without a break, explaining his theory about Joey's memory lapses. I wish I thought it was that simple, MaryAnne said. The boy you're describing sounds a lot more, well, stoic. And Joey isn't stoic. If anything, he's volatile. Joey's always been like that. When he went on, his voice had taken on a guarded quality. How, well, did you know Ted? Ted, MaryAnne echoed silently. With everyone I talk to, it always comes back to Ted. I'm beginning to wonder if I knew him at all, she finally replied. The doctor nodded. He could be very strict with Joey sometimes, and the last couple of years Ted seemed to be getting harder on the boy. MaryAnne's expression tightened. Are you saying he had gotten abusive? Cochran heaved a sigh. Oh, well, I'm afraid I wasn't very willing to confront Ted. But try not to worry. I'll get Joey through this. How? She asked, anger coursing through her. How do you propose to help Joey when you knew what was going on and did nothing to stop it? You should have reported what you suspected to the police. Wondering if the doctor had made any notations about it, she began flipping through the records in Joey's folder. She came to the back where a copy of Joey's birth certificate appeared. She stared at it for a long moment. Something was wrong. Audrey told me Joey was born prematurely. Did you handle Audrey's pregnancy? Cochran shook his head. I wasn't here then. It says here he weighed 8 pounds 9 ounces when he was born. That's awfully heavy for a 7-month preemie, isn't it? Cochran frowned. Are you sure Audrey said he was premature? Absolutely, her heart beginning to beat faster as she calculated when Audrey must have gotten pregnant if Joey had been full term. It certainly explains why Ted would have been so hard on Joey. I don't understand, Cochran began, but MaryAnne didn't let him finish. If Joey was full term, then Ted couldn't possibly have been his father. But if Ted wasn't his father, who? She went silent as she remembered the man who had been all but hidden in the trees at Ted and Audrey's funeral. The man living by himself up in the mountains. Was it possible? Suddenly, one of Olivia's remarks rose out of her memory. When Audrey married him a month after she'd met him, I had plenty to say. Told her she was just on the rebound, that she hardly knew Ted. On the rebound. Ted must have known the truth. He had turned against the boy he knew wasn't his son. Dr. Cochran, if Joey's real father were to show up, would there be any way to prove it? Through blood tests or something? Cochran shook his head. The only way we could prove paternity would be through a DNA analysis, and that's expensive. MaryAnne's features set in determination. I want you to take a sample of Joey's blood and get a lab working on the analysis. I have a feeling we are going to need it. The man paused to listen. The dogs were still far away, but they were getting closer. The same dogs that had been out last night tracking Joey when he had found the boy wandering in the woods following what? A voice inside himself that only he could hear? An instinct deep within him imprinted so strongly that he had no choice but to obey when the urge came on him? The madness had been in Joey since the day he was born. The man had even known the cycles of Joey's madness. How many times had he gone down to the valley and felt Joey's own needs, felt the mind of the child reaching out to his own? 2 minds, with a single instinct. Were there only 2 of them? How many might there be, struggling against the demons inside them, struggling as he had struggled, as Joey had just begun to struggle? Now the cabin had been found. He had to abandon it and find a place to hide before they came to kill him. For that was what they were going to do. Surely anyone who looked upon him would know him for what he was. Know him and hate him. As they would come to hate Joey, too. With Joey, though, it was barely beginning the change within. No one else would see it yet. To the others, Joey would still seem normal. No, they wouldn't see it until it was far too late.
He glanced around, searching for a place of sanctuary. Then he saw a cleft, high up above the timberline, that would give him protection on 3 sides. Give him protection, but trap him, too. Below him, the baying of the hounds grew louder. "Unleash one of them," Tony said as the icy rain began to fall. Frank stared at the deputy. "You nuts? He'll be gone before—" "We're close enough," Tony interrupted. "He's somewhere nearby." Reaching down, he unsnapped the leash from one of Frank's hounds. The dog leaped forward, his eager baying rising as he followed the scent of the creature he was tracking. The hound moved quickly, for the scent was strong, and unlike anything he had smelled before. His head low, he bounded up the mountainside. The man braced himself. One of the dogs was close now, very close. The men had unleashed it, which was good. It meant he'd have time before they got here. He was ready for them, as ready as he would ever be. As the wolf snarled a low warning, the man dropped his hand to her head, quieting her. Suddenly the dog was there, silhouetted in the opening of the cleft. It stopped dead in its tracks, silent for a moment. Then it let out a howl of victory as it leaped toward them. But the baying was cut short, changing into a wailing scream of agony as the wolf leaped forward, her jaws closing on the dog's throat. "What the hell happened up there?" Frank asked, as the last terrified yelp of his best hound died away. Tony's eyes narrowed. "I'd say whatever's cornered up there just killed the dog. Come on." Turning from Frank, he started up the steep slope, picking his way carefully, wary of the sheer cliff at the bottom of the slope. The rain that had begun falling was quickly turning to sleet. The rocks glistened. A slip here would lead to far worse than a sprained ankle. After what seemed an eternity, Tony was able to duck into the relative shelter of a great gash in the face of the cliff, and waited for Frank to catch up. Frank yelled, "I'm coming!" Suddenly he felt a tug at the hound's leash. He dropped it instantly as the dog scrambled the last few feet, finding a purchase on the bare rock where Frank could see no crevices at all. Frank moved slowly, but all at once he was sliding toward the precipice 40 feet below. Unable to tear his eyes away, Tony watched as Frank plunged over the edge of the cliff. Still staring at the spot at which Frank had disappeared, Tony took his radio and reported what had just happened. He described the cliff upon which he stood, and then said, "I'm not sure I can get back down. The weather's getting worse, so I'm gonna go on up." At last he turned away and started grimly up the slippery rock. Above him, the second hound was baying excitedly. Tony kept going, finally coming to a ledge. A moment later, he heard the same brief howl of pain that he had heard only minutes before. Tony eased himself along the ledge until he was only a few feet from the deep cut that sank into the cliff. At last, he sprang out of the center of the cleft, his gun braced in both hands. Immediately, he saw something coming at him. He fired. The wolf howled with pain as the slug ripped into her flank. Whimpering, the animal backed away. The mountain man suddenly dropped down from the narrow crevice he'd wedged himself into and landed on Tony. His heavily muscled arm slid around Tony's neck and with a quick jerk snapped it, then picked up the deputy's twitching body and pitched it off the ledge. "Rick? Rick, wake up!" His wife shook him harder. He came slowly awake. "What are you doing, Gilly? I barely got to sleep." "We've got a problem, honey. I was listening to the scanner and I heard Tony calling down. Rick, Frank's dead. He lost his footing and Tony couldn't get to him." Gilly's words cleared the fog from Rick's mind. "Oh, Christ. Where's Tony? Is he okay?" "He's got whoever lives in that cabin trapped and he's going after him." "What? By himself? That's nuts." "He said he didn't think he could get back down. There's a storm coming in." But Rick wasn't listening anymore. He'd snatched up the telephone, punching in the numbers for the dispatcher's office. "Debbie, Rick Martin, let me hear the recording of Tony's last call." He listened intently to Tony's voice. Rick knew exactly the area he had described. "I'm going up there," he told Gilly, reaching for his uniform. "Are you insane, Rick? It's freezing cold and raining." "Then I'd better get going." 20 minutes later, he'd passed through the deserted campground in which Glenn Foster had died. It was another quarter of an hour before he came to the base of the cliff, from which Frank had fallen. 10 minutes after that, he found Frank's body. Only a few yards from Frank, he found Tony. His partner was sprawled on his back, his head twisted grotesquely. As Rick stared at Tony's face, the mountain man slipped through the forest 1,000 yards away. He was once more moving through the wilderness, the force of the storm only spurring him on as the bloodlust surged to the surface. While Joey was caring for the horses, MaryAnne gazed around the storage attic, searching for some reference to the man Audrey had been dating before she met Ted. But there was nothing, except a picture. A single picture in the photo album downstairs, showing Audrey standing next to a tall, broad-shouldered man with heavy features. MaryAnne picked up the phone and dialed Olivia's number, getting only the answering machine. Olivia, she said, I have a weird idea about who the man up in the mountains might be. Please call me as soon as you can. Hanging up, she glanced at her watch. It was almost 3, time to pick up the kids at school. The rain had turned completely to snow by the time MaryAnne got to the school, and as Logan and Allison dashed down the steps, she gazed worriedly up at the gray sky.
Ooh, isn't this neat?
Logan asked, scrambling into the front seat.
I bet we get snowed in.
MaryAnne smiled at her son. I wouldn't start getting my hopes up. By tomorrow, it'll probably all be melted.
It will not. Mike Stifel says it'll be 8 feet deep. He says...
It sounds like what he says might be just a little exaggerated, MaryAnne cut in, pulling away from the curb.
Michael and Andrea Stifel are jerks,
Allison announced from the back seat. Oh? And what brought that on?
They were talking about Joey. They said...
Then Logan noticed that Joey wasn't in the car.
Where is he? The doctor didn't make him go to the hospital, did he?
He's fine, MaryAnne assured him. He's at home, taking care of Sheikah.
What did the doctor say?
Allison asked.
Is something really wrong with Joey?
MaryAnne hesitated, wondering how much she should tell Allison and Logan. He's having some trouble adjusting to his parents dying. Joey's bound to have some times when he feels very angry.
Well, why shouldn't he be?
Allison asked, the fear of Joey she'd felt giving way to sympathy.
It's not fair. Both of his parents are dead, and now the kids are starting to talk like Joey was some kind of monster.
A few minutes later, they pulled into the yard, which was already covered with an inch of snow. All 3 of them piled into the kitchen. Outside, the snow was falling harder. Whew, makes me cold just to look at it, MaryAnne said. Allison, why don't you build us a fire, and I'll make some hot cocoa. Call Joey down from his room, will you, Logan? She was just starting to heat the milk when Logan came back.
He's not up there.
Struggling to conceal her panic, MaryAnne quickly pulled her coat back on, then ran out to the barn. Joey, she called, her fear rising. Joey? She heard a movement from the loft and peered into the darkness above. I'm coming down, she heard him call. When he scrambled down a moment later, she stared. Joey's face and his clothes were covered with snow. Joey, what on earth? I was watching the snow. I opened the door up there. I wasn't doing anything wrong. He's afraid, MaryAnne thought. He's afraid of me. She went to him, slipping her arms around him. Of course you weren't, but you must be freezing. Let's get you inside. You can take a nice, long, hot bath. Joey let MaryAnne lead him back to the house. As they stepped out of the barn, though, Joey realized that despite the sub-freezing temperatures, he wasn't cold at all. Joey stared at the steaming bathtub. He felt no desire to lower his body into it. He felt a strange heat deep in his bones, a heat that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room, for even when he'd sat in the open door of the hayloft, he hadn't noticed the cold against his skin. All he'd felt were the calming effects of the wind and the snow, driving out the terrifying nervousness that had been building inside him. He had imagined he could hear sounds that he knew were impossible. Even his nose had detected scents he'd never noticed before, faint aromas of the creatures of the forest, each distinct, each exciting. Now, as he sat in the tub, the heat of the water combined with a peculiar warmth inside him made him feel almost faint. He began washing his hair. As he worked the lather into the scalp, he realized that his hair seemed different. He could feel a slight roughness. Puzzled, He dipped his head beneath the surface to wash the soap away. Without warning, a wave of claustrophobia broke over him. The tub seemed suddenly tiny. He stood up, shaking his body violently. The stifling heat choking him, he raised the window over the tub and breathed deeply of the cold air that poured in. Feeling slightly better, he stepped out of the tub and began drying himself off. Catching a glimpse of his foggy image in the mirror, he stared. It was no longer the image he'd seen this morning. His eyes seemed to have narrowed slightly. The down on his cheek seemed to have darkened. He ran his fingers through his hair and once more felt the strange roughness. Leaning forward, he examined his scalp. Tiny hairs were coming out of his skin, almost invisible, yet they were there. He swallowed, staring at the image in the mirror. What was happening to him? Panic welled up in him. Suddenly, despite the open window, everything was closing in on him once again. Rick dropped to the ground, sheltering himself in a fallen tree. The snow was deepening rapidly. He should have been back to the Jeep half an hour ago, but he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now he knew he was lost. Pulling the radio from his belt, he switched it on, and a moment later began talking to the dispatcher. "Well, it looks like I'm going to be spending the night on the mountain. The snow's really coming down, but I found a spot to hole up, and I'm going to be building a fire. Talk to you in the morning." If I'm still alive in the morning, he thought, as he clicked the radio off. While Allison was getting out the Monopoly game, MaryAnne threw another log on the fire. "Now, this isn't so bad, is it?" Outside, the snow was falling so heavily that it seemed to form a white shroud around the house.
"It's cool," Logan replied. "I bet we get snowed in for a week. Wouldn't that be neat?"
Not if I don't have enough food in the house, MaryAnne thought. What if something happens and we can't get out? Her ruminations were interrupted by Storm, who trotted into the den, whimpering softly as he pawed MaryAnne's leg.
"I'll take him out," her son said.
"No," she cried. "Logan!" She got to the kitchen just as the little boy was pulling on his jacket. "Logan, you are not going outside. You'll catch pneumonia."
"I will not."
He pulled the door open just far enough for Storm to slither through, but then his mother pushed it closed again.
"Oh, Mom."
Just then the telephone began to ring. Picking up the phone, MaryAnne said distractedly, "Hello?" "MaryAnne?" It was Olivia. "I got your message. What's up?" "Oh, Olivia, listen, I found a—" Seeing Logan watching her, she sent him back to Allison in the den. "Olivia, Joey wasn't premature at all, so Ted can't be his father. I found a picture of a big, tall man standing with Audrey." There was silence at the other end. Then Olivia spoke. "His name was Slater, Shane Slater, but that's not the name we knew him as." MaryAnne's blood ran cold. Who was he?" Another silence. Then, "He was a strange man, MaryAnne. He showed up in Sun Valley in the spring that year. He told everyone his name was Randy Durrell. Audrey was crazy about him, and then he disappeared one day." "Just disappeared?" "We found out why the next day. 2 FBI agents showed up, looking for Slater. They told us he should be considered very dangerous." "They never caught him, did they?" "Well, if they did, we never heard about—" "Oh, but that was nearly 14 years ago, MaryAnne. It couldn't be the same man. "Why not?" MaryAnne broke in. "What if he just disappeared up into the mountains? What if he knows Joey is his son? What if he knew what Ted was doing to Joey? What would he do, Olivia? What would you do?" Olivia finally spoke.
"I would have killed Ted, I suppose. And I might even have killed Audrey for letting Ted abuse my son."
"Oh, Olivia, that is exactly what I was thinking."
"MaryAnne, until we know what is going on, I think you had better pack up those kids and bring them here. This is turning into a real blizzard."
MaryAnne gazed out into the darkening yard. The snow was coming down faster than ever. "Oh, I wonder if I can make it. It must be a foot deep already."
"Well, if you leave now, you shouldn't have any trouble. I got plenty of room and—"
"Mom!" Allison suddenly yelled from the den. "The roof's leaking." "Oh, God. Olivia, let me call you back." She dropped the phone on the hook and went into the den. Water was starting to drip down to the floor. Get a pan to catch it, Allison. I'll go see if I can find out where it's coming from. Trying to picture which room was above the den, MaryAnne ran up the stairs. Then instantly knew. The children's bathroom. She dashed down the hall, calling her godson's name. "Joey? Joey?" There was no answer. She knocked loudly on the door. "Joey, what's going on in there?" Why didn't Joey answer her? Suddenly she had a vision of him lying in the bathtub, his head under the water, his skin the horrible gray of death. Could he have slipped? Then she saw another vision of him huddled on the edge of the cliff, staring mournfully over the abyss. Oh, God, no! She tried the door. Locked. "Allison!" she screamed. "Logan, come help me!" "Mom, what's wrong?" Allison asked as she raced down the hall. "The door's locked. Joey's locked himself inside and the tub's running and he won't answer me and I'll get an axe." Logan raced down the stairs, coming back a moment later with a small hatchet used for kindling. MaryAnne snatched the tool and swung it at the door. On the third blow, the panel shattered. MaryAnne reached through, then found the inside knob. The door swung open, releasing a blast of icy air into the hall. With Allison and Logan pushing in behind her, MaryAnne stared at the overflowing tub. Joey wasn't in it. Her eyes fell on Joey's bathrobe, still hanging on the bathroom door. No, it was impossible. He couldn't have climbed out the window stark naked with a blizzard howling outside. Was he crazy? Racing down the stairs, MaryAnne ran to the front door, pulled it open, and stepped out onto the porch. "Joey! Joey, where are you? Come back!" She was about to go out into the storm to find Joey when she heard Allison. "Mom, come back. You'll get lost out there." MaryAnne hesitated, torn between her need to go after Joey and her certainty that Allison was right. The police. She had to call the police. She ran to the den, picked up the phone, stabbing the 3 emergency digits. No sound at all was coming from the telephone's receiver. Now Joey was gone, and the phone was dead. The man moved through the blizzard with the instincts of an animal. Even the storm barely hindered his progress. He had left the injured wolf in the protection of the cleft, certain she would survive. Her wound was clean, and within a day she would be back on her feet. He slipped through the trees toward the house, masked by the swirling snow. He was still 20 yards from the building when he heard the cry, "Joey! Joey, where are you? Come back!" He paused, unwilling to move close enough to risk being seen. He understood what had happened. Somewhere in the gloom, Joey was searching for him. The barn loomed ahead, one door ajar. Knowing now where Joey was, the man silently slipped through the open door. His eyes adjusted instantly to the dim light. His nose picked up a scent drifting down from the hayloft. Joey. He moved forward silently, mounted the ladder, and a moment later was in the loft. Crouched at the end, Joey was nestled deep in the hay. As the man approached, the boy looked up, his eyes frightened. The man dropped down next to him. "Don't be frightened, Joey. I won't hurt you." Joey looked up at the man, his eyes wide as he stared into the distorted face. "It's my fault," the man finally spoke. "But I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know." "Know what?" "I tried to tell them. I came down to talk to them so they could help you. It should have been safe that day, Joey. I was feeling good, but when I came into the barn, the horse shied." Suddenly, Joey understood. "My dad? You killed my dad." "I wanted to tell him what was going to happen to you. I wanted him to stop hurting you. I thought if he knew, maybe he could have helped you." "He hated me. I was glad when he died." "I killed that man in the campground, Joey. And I killed Bill Sykes. That's why I'm here. I have to tell you what's going to happen to you, Joey. It's starting. You can feel it, can't you, Joey? The emptiness in your gut and the tingling on your skin." Joey's eyes widened with wonder. Almost involuntarily, he nodded. "It will get worse, Joey. Soon, you'll be like me. You'll have to hide in the woods. If anyone sees you, they'll want to kill you. You'll hunt, Joey, for people."
No.
But the man kept talking, whispering Joey's future relentlessly into his ear. It's in your blood, Joey, just like it's in mine. You'll start changing soon. Your fingernails will turn into claws, and hair will grow all over your body. Look. He ripped off his shirt. Joey stared at the curling hair that all but covered the man's skin. Touch it. Almost hypnotized, Joey reached out. Fur. It felt like fur. Suddenly he remembered the strange hairs on his head, the dark shadow on his face.
But why?
Joey pleaded. Because I'm your father, Joey. My name is Shane Slater, and I'm your father. A second later, he was gone, disappearing into the storm. Yet his words still hung in the air. Your father, Joey. My name is Shane Slater, and I'm your father. In the depths of his soul, Joey knew it was true. Logan gazed up at his mother, his eyes wide with fear.
What are we gonna do, Mom?
MaryAnne stood trembling by the desk, the dead telephone still in her hand.
The bathroom.
Her mind grasping at anything with which to deal until she could begin thinking clearly. Get some rags from the pantry, Logan. She heard Allison's voice behind her, trying to offer her comfort.
It's not your fault, Mom, and we'll find him. I know we will.
Nodding, but unable to speak, MaryAnne mounted the stairs. Logan was just starting toward the pantry when he heard something at the door. A scratching sound. Storm, or maybe even Joey. He darted to the back door and pulled it open. Nothing. Without thinking, he stepped out onto the back porch.
Joey?
He yelled.
Hey, Joey! Is that you?
His words were drowned by the wind. He turned around when suddenly the wind shifted and the back door slammed shut. Logan reached for the knob, trying to twist it. Locked. Hunching his shoulders, he left the porch and started toward the front of the house, testing each window. All of them were locked. He was just coming to the front of the house when he saw a movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned toward it. He saw a massive shape come toward him. As Logan stared up into the coarse, heavily bearded face of the mountain man, the little boy turned to run. When he tripped, sprawling face down in the snow, he felt himself being lifted up.
No! Let go of me! Mom!
Shh. Shane Slater held him. Have to get you... But before he could say anything else, Storm hurtled out of the blizzard, charging toward Slater, his teeth bared. He launched himself toward the throat of the man whose arms were wrapped around Logan. Slater tried to turn away. The German shepherd's jaws closed as they came in contact with human flesh. Logan's flesh. The dog's teeth sank into Logan's neck, piercing the jugular. With a quick twist, Slater broke the dog's grip on Logan, and Storm uttered a yelp of agony as his mandible shattered. Leaving the dog where it lay, Slater picked up Logan. Blood was gushing from the wound in Logan's neck. No, don't die. Please don't die. But it was no use, and when the boy's body lay limp and lifeless in his arms, Slater laid him gently in the snow, then straightened up. He staggered away, his mind beginning to fail. Once more he began circling the house, peering in through the windows. Tonight, one more time before he died, he would go into the warmth of a house. A real house. This house. Olivia paced nervously in the small living room of her house down the valley from El Monte. Twice she'd picked up the telephone to call MaryAnne back, but both times it had been busy. Now, when she tried a third time, her phone was dead, and she suddenly realized what had happened. MaryAnne's phone hadn't been busy at all. It had just gone out before Olivia's had. Better if she just took her truck up there right now and led them down herself. Her 5-year-old pickup had made it through worse snow than this. Starting the truck, she put it in low gear and started down the driveway to the road. As soon as she left the shelter of the house, the snow deepened, and she wondered if she ought to stop and put on chains. No time for that. She switched the truck into 4-wheel drive. The run up to El Monte, which normally took no more than a few minutes, was going to take a lot longer this afternoon. "Logan, where are those rags?" MaryAnne stood at the top of the stairs, calling down to her son. It had been more than 10 minutes since she and Allison had come upstairs. When there was no answer from below, she hurried down. She was halfway across to the pantry door when she stopped short, staring at the floor just inside the door. A small pile of snow was rapidly melting into a puddle. She dashed to the door, jerking it open. "Logan! Logan, come back here this instant!" As the wind struck her, she stepped back into the house. "Bring my coat, Allison, hurry!" A few seconds later, Allison dashed into the kitchen. "Logan's gone." MaryAnne grabbed the coat and shoved her arms into the sleeves. How could he have done something so stupid? Without waiting for a reply, she jerked the door open and stumbled outside. Allison ran to the open door, calling after her mother. "Mom, don't leave me alone." But it was too late. MaryAnne was already disappearing into the swirling snow. Almost blinded by the wind-driven powder, MaryAnne stumbled through the snow, uncertain of where she was going. Too late, she realized she had brought nothing with her. Not a flashlight, certainly not the shotgun. If she didn't find Logan soon, Which way was the house? The barn? Which way should she go? Panic closed around her. "Think," she commanded herself. The wind. From which direction had it been coming? She stood still, concentrating hard, then remembered the kitchen door and the wind pushing at it every time she'd tried to shut it. If she walked into the wind, sooner or later she would come to the barn. She might find Joey and Logan there. Her panic receding slightly, she turned until the wind was blowing directly in her face. After 5 steps, she felt her left foot strike against something that gave as her shoe struck it. Dropping to her knees, she brushed the snow away and gasped as her fingers touched Storm's fur. Her mind raced as she looked at the dog's lifeless body. Was that what had brought Logan outside? Had Logan heard Storm barking? Or only his last howl before whatever attacked him finished the kill? "Oh, my God, Logan! Logan!" MaryAnne started to stagger away, still intent on reaching the comparative safety of the barn. But once more she stopped. For this time, she saw the object blocking her path before she tripped over it. A scream rose in her throat as she dropped to the ground to gather the lifeless body of her son into her arms. Cradling Logan, as she had when he was a baby, MaryAnne was no longer aware of anything except an agony from which she would never recover. Olivia was still a quarter of a mile from the ranch when suddenly she felt the right front tire leave the pavement. A moment later, 3 of the truck's 4 wheels were in the ditch, and Olivia furiously slammed her fist on the dash. All of her common sense told her to stay where she was, but she knew damn well she could walk from here up to the ranch blindfolded if she had to. She took a flashlight out of the glove compartment and her shotgun from the rack behind the seat. She started up the road, feeling each step with her foot. When she turned around, even the truck had disappeared into the blinding snow. Olivia felt completely alone. The freezing wind began to penetrate the thick coat that was MaryAnne's only protection. She stared down into Logan's face and had the odd sensation that she was looking into a face of a stranger. She would carry this child, this stranger, into the barn, and then she would go on looking for Logan. She staggered to her feet, stumbling as she struggled to clutch the body closer, and something inside her reminded her to walk into the wind. A few moments later, she came to the fence and paused. Who was out here, concealed in the blinding whiteness, striking out with viciousness? A stranger named Shane Slater? Joey? Her mind refused to entertain the thought no more. Whether it was Joey or something else, she wouldn't let herself fall victim to it. She and Allison would both survive. She moved quickly now, following the fence to the barn. Then she was there. Inside, she thought. Can't leave him here to be buried in the snow. She pulled hard on the door, forcing it open wide enough to wriggle through. She hurried past the horses, and then in the empty stall gently laid Logan's body on the straw and knelt beside him. But for the terrible wound in his throat, she could almost imagine that he might only be asleep. Suddenly, the horses began moving restlessly, and then MaryAnne heard a sound behind her. Whirling, she saw the latch of the back door move. Someone was outside, trying to get in. As whatever was outside gave vent to a terrifying howl, MaryAnne raced toward the front door. She dashed outside, her only goal to reach the safety of the house. The unearthly howl rose over the wail of the wind, then died away. Olivia stopped in her tracks, a shudder passing through her as the inhuman cry faded. Not human, but unlike any animal she ever heard. Olivia glanced around. She felt a stab of fear. What if the tortured being that had uttered that chilling cry was already searching her out? Unslinging her shotgun from her shoulder, she pumped a cartridge into the chamber. Holding the gun in both hands, she continued her slow progress. She had taken no more than 3 steps when she heard something moving in the woods to her left. Swinging around, she raised the shotgun, but nothing appeared in the sights. Nothing except a thick curtain of white. When she heard it again, closer now, but still could see nothing, she turned and fled, plunging into the woods. By the time the deer, that had been disturbed by her passage, jumped out onto the driveway, Olivia had disappeared into the storm, already lost. MaryAnne burst through the back door, slamming it behind her, her whole body shaking.
"What is it, Mom?" Allison asked. "Where's Logan? What was that sound?"
I don't know," MaryAnne said. "There's something out there, Allison. It killed Storm and She couldn't say it. Her voice cracked, and seeing Allison's eyes glisten with tears, MaryAnne realized that the tragedy had been clear on her face. She went to her daughter, putting her arms around her. "There's nothing we can do for him, darling."
"Oh, Mommy, what are we going to do?"
"I don't know." Suddenly, she caught a glimpse of something at the window over the sink. A face. Narrow, feral eyes, glittering. Her mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that might prevent whatever was outside from getting into the house, but there were too many windows, too many doors. The gun. "Come on." Turning, she raced into the den, jerking the gun out of the rack.
"What's going to happen, Mommy?"
Allison asked as MaryAnne fumbled with the gun. "It's all right," her voice belying her words. "We're going to be okay." A moment later, she slid 2 shells inside, closed the magazine, then pumped a shell into the firing chamber. Allison froze, the color draining from her face as she stared at the window. MaryAnne's gaze followed her daughter's, and she gasped. Peering in were those same eyes she'd seen in the kitchen. Now, though, the rest of the face was visible as well. The heavy features, the eyes sunken and glittering, the tangle of matted hair caked now with snow. The man was bare-chested, and MaryAnne could see his powerful shoulders. He was glaring at her with eyes filled with insane fury. She raised the gun, but the face disappeared from the window. Then, a second later, there was a pounding on the front door. Allison's eyes widened, and she came over to stand by her mother, pressing close to her. MaryAnne was about to take a step toward the living room when there was a crash, followed by the tinkling of glass.
"He broke in, Mommy. He's inside the house."
"Shh! Don't move." Once again, MaryAnne raised the gun, training it on the doorway. She heard a scuffling sound, then a grunt. A shadow appeared on the living room floor, MaryAnne's eyes fixed on it, watching it change shape as the man who cast it moved slowly toward the door of the den. As her eyes caught a movement, she jerked the gun to it, instinctively squeezing the trigger. The gun roared, instantly followed by a howl of pain. His chest was covered with blood, and his left hand clutching at the wound. He started toward them, staggering into the room, his right hand reaching out toward them, its claw-like nails slashing at the air. MaryAnne, panic rising in her, pumped the second cartridge into the chamber, raised the gun, and once more squeezed the trigger. Again the roar of the gun filled the room. His eyes opened wide as the buckshot tore into his stomach, knocking him backwards. His legs gave way, and suddenly he dropped, rolling over on his back. Then, his eyes closing, his whole great frame shuddered, and he lay still. MaryAnne and Allison stared in shock at the body. Outside, the howling wind of the blizzard, finally spent, died away. Silence, a terrible silence, filled the house. Joey came slowly out of the dark reverie into which he had fallen. He was still in the loft. Shotgun blasts echoed in his ears, but he wasn't sure whether they had been real. A moment later, though, he heard a faint scream. Something had happened. Something terrible. He pressed his eye to a knothole as he watched the back door open, and a figure emerged. 2 figures, backing out of the kitchen, dragging something after them. A body. The body of the man who had been in the loft with him, who had claimed to be his father. As he watched MaryAnne and Allison drag the corpse out into the snowy yard, he felt a dark rage rising inside him. They had killed him, shot him, as if he'd been no more than an animal. Joey moved toward the ladder. A moment later, he was slipping into the tack room. There were some old clothes there. He pulled them on, then moved toward the back of the barn where a small door led outside. He peered out. The body of the mountain man lay in the snow. Joey dropped to his knees to look into his face. His father. Deep inside, he knew it was true. Now he knew why he'd never been afraid to wander alone up in the mountains. Now he knew why he'd never made friends. He was different. Something inside him was different from everyone else. That was why he would spend so much of his time alone or with the animals on the ranch. And always the mountains had beckoned to him. Reaching out to caress Shane Slater's cheek as earlier Slater had caressed his, Joey opened his mouth, and out of his throat rose an unearthly howl of anguish. Anguish and rage. At long last, Joey had truly become his father's son. Olivia heard the howl rise out of the silence of the falling snow. It felt like hours that she had spent stumbling through the snow, desperately searching for some recognizable landmark. Now, though, something familiar at last emerged from the whiteout. One of the pine trees with a gnarled trunk. She had seen it every time she came up to the ranch, its unique form always catching her eye, but this afternoon she was approaching it from a different direction. Suddenly, she understood what had happened. When she'd gotten lost, she had moved north through the woods instead of west. Then the sheds, barn, and the house were just beyond the tree, as well as whatever creature had uttered that howl of rage. Removing her shotgun from her shoulder, Olivia checked the chamber to be certain the cartridge was ready, then started toward the ranch's outbuildings. Kneeling by his father's corpse, Joey picked up the faint sound of snow crunching under walking feet. His body tensed, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Then he scuttled away, disappearing around the corner of the shed, all his senses alert as he waited. The back of the barn was visible now, and Olivia redoubled her efforts. Only a few more yards. As she passed the tractor shed, she stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes widening as she saw a corpse lying in the snow, the gaping wound in its belly, still oozing blood. Suddenly, a menacing snarl penetrated Olivia's ears. As she started to swing around, Joey sprang at her, his body smashing into her back with enough force to knock her to the ground. The shotgun went off as she fell, its recoil tearing her right shoulder, and Olivia screamed at the searing pain, then felt an arm snake around her neck, felt the pressure of it cutting off her breath. Then, Joey's teeth sank into the back of her neck. When his grisly work was done, and he felt Olivia's body lying still beneath him, Joey stood up. Fresh blood glistened on his sweater. As he stared down at the woman he had just killed, a surge of heat poured through him. He felt strong and powerful, energized by the kill, and he finally understood who and what he was. Turning away from Olivia's corpse, he loped toward the forest. Only when he was at the edge did he stop to look back. Through the falling snow, the house was just visible, and he gazed at it for a moment, then turned away. It was no longer his home. From now on, his home would be the mountains, where he would live as his father had lived, hiding during the day, coming out only at night, coming out to hunt in the darkness. MaryAnne came awake slowly, her eyes blinking in the bright sunlight flooding the living room. How long has she been asleep? Then slowly, the memory of what had happened flooded back. Allison had cried herself to sleep in her arms. Then she had heard a howl rising from somewhere beyond the barn, and her blood had run cold. She had cradled her daughter protectively. A terrible silence followed the bestial howl of rage, and then there had been a single blast of a shotgun, followed by a scream of pain and terror, a woman's scream, Olivia's scream. From the moment she had heard it, MaryAnne had known Olivia had died. Allison had remained asleep as MaryAnne slowly got up from the couch to look out the window. Then she had seen Joey. He had appeared from somewhere beyond the barn, running across the field, and it was then that she understood. It was he who had killed Olivia. When he had turned to gaze at the house, the brilliant red stains on the white sweater he was wearing confirmed the bitter truth. She had watched as he disappeared into the forest. She had lost track of time after that, gently rocking Allison. Soon, she had drifted off as well.
"Mommy?"
Allison said, her voice sounding sleepy. MaryAnne, now fully awake, turned to face her daughter.
"It all really happened, didn't it?"
MaryAnne could only nod, unable to summon any words at all.
"Mommy, what are we going to do? Are we going to go home? Are we going to go back to Daddy?"
Mommy, Daddy. Only yesterday morning Allison had still been calling her Mom, and it had been years since she'd referred to her father as anything but Dad. Now, after the terrible trauma, she had reverted to the names from her babyhood. Her heart going out to her daughter, who was now all she had left, MaryAnne put her arms around Allison once more. I don't know what we're going to do, darling," she said, holding her close. Then a thought came into her mind. What if Joey comes back? What if no one comes to help us, and Joey comes back? High up in the mountains, Rick stirred, his fitful dozing at an end. Every bone in his body ached with cold, but he had survived the night. He kicked snow onto the already dying fire, then set out, threading his way through the underbrush until at last he came back to the Jeep. After digging as much snow as he could from the car, he got in and tried the engine. It ground for a few seconds, coughed, then caught. 30 minutes later, Rick emerged from the forest and gazed at the house some 40 yards away. He finally made it to the front porch and banged loudly on the door. "It's Rick Martin, Mrs. Carpenter," the deputy called. "Are you all right?" The door opened, and MaryAnne peered out at him. Rick could see by the look of pure terror in her eyes that something had gone very wrong.
"Oh, thank God you're here. They're dead. They're all dead. Logan, Olivia, Slater, all dead."
"Where's Joey?" he asked. MaryAnne's eyes fixed on Rick's face for a moment, then drifted toward the soaring mountain peaks.
"Gone. That man, his name was Shane Slater, and he was Joey's father. And now Joey's gone. He's gone up into the mountains just like his father did."
Joey's eyes snapped open, his senses instantly alert. He was in the cabin, his father's cabin, and once more he'd slept in his father's bed, curled beneath a mound of animal skins. But he wasn't alone. He could sense a presence lurking somewhere nearby. He went outside and whistled, a single soft, low note. A moment later he heard a barely audible whimpering, and then the wolf emerged from the dense bushes. She gazed steadily at Joey, her eyes glittering. After a few seconds, Joey dropped to a crouch, holding his hand out toward her. "Come on, girl," he said. "It's okay. Come on." The wolf hesitated for a moment, but then moved forward. The boy held out his hand, letting her sniff at his fingers, then reached out to stroke her head. She made no move to shy away. Joey became aware of an ominous sound echoing off the rocky cliffs above. He scanned the valley below. A helicopter was moving up the valley. As Joey watched, it began dropping down into the field at El Monte. Joey's mind began to race. They would start looking for him soon, and he knew where they would look first. He darted back into the cabin, already searching for things he could use while he hunted for a place to live. Filling his pockets, he wrapped himself in one of the bearskins, then whistled softly to the wolf. A moment later, Joey was gone, the wolf hobbling after him as he began climbing higher up into the mountains. Higher up, where there were caverns in which he could hide while he learned how to live as his father had lived. Like his father before him, Joey would disappear into the mountains, leaving no trace behind him. Late that afternoon in his office in Boise, Hank Henry gazed disbelievingly at the coroner's report that had just arrived on his desk. Fingernails like claws, canine teeth much longer than the teeth that flanked them, ending in sharp points. Slater's jaw, too, was different, the dental arch distorted into an oddly wedge-shaped form. There were anomalies, too, about Slater's eyes and ears. The contents of his stomach showed that his diet had consisted, at least in part, of raw meat. What confounded Hank were the samples of hair and blood that had been flown down to Boise along with the preliminary report of the autopsy. Hair samples described as inconsistent with available human samples, and blood unresponsive to testing by local lab. It had taken Henry no time at all to find a match for the hair sample. It had instantly been matched to one scraped from the fingernails of Tamara Reynolds. At least he now had proof of who had killed Glenn Foster and, he suspected, Bill Sykes. But what the hell did it mean? Sighing, he turned to his computer and typed in the information that would bring up Shane Slater's criminal record. The report came up, and Hank began reading it. Nothing major. The man had been involved in anti-war movements during Vietnam and had taken part in blowing up a selective service office. Slater had turned himself in. He had been a model prisoner, but then something strange had happened. He had killed 2 nurses during an escape from a prison hospital and had been a fugitive ever since. Hank frowned, then called the federal prison where Slater had been held. He found himself talking to the warden. "I've got a body up here that I've identified as being a former prisoner of yours, Shane Slater." When the warden finally replied, his voice was guarded. "All the public information on Slater is in the report I assume you're looking at right now. Everything else is classified." Hank translated the warden's words. The government was up to something, and they didn't want anyone to know what. His suspicion was confirmed a moment later when the computer screen suddenly went blank. When he tried to recall the record he'd been looking at only seconds earlier, a single line came up on the screen. All databanks searched, no records found. Shane Slater had just disappeared from the files of the United States government. What's going to happen to the horses? The thought came into MaryAnne's mind out of nowhere. She and Allison were ready to leave the house, the belongings they'd brought with them barely 2 weeks ago already packed into their suitcases. By this evening, she and Allison would be gone from the ranch to spend the night at the lodge, and after the funeral for Logan, they would be gone from Sugarloaf as well. Gone forever. She turned back to Charlie Hawkins and Margaret Stiffel, who had accompanied her out of the house. "We're going to have to arrange for someone to look after the horses," she told Hawkins. "Well, Michael can do it," Margaret told her. "We're just down the road, and he loves horses." "Do you think he would?" MaryAnne asked anxiously. "After what happened?" She felt a shudder pass over her. "Oh, he'll be fine," Margaret assured her. "We'll keep an eye on him and drive him up here." Still, MaryAnne hesitated, something telling her to refuse Margaret's offer. But what other choice did she have? "Oh, all right. I'm sure it won't be for long anyway. We'll be selling the ranch as soon as we can, won't we, Charlie?" "We'll talk about that later on," the lawyer said. This was not the time to remind MaryAnne that the ranch was not hers to sell. It was in trust for Joey. "We can sort it all out after things have settled down," he went on. As they left the house forever, neither she nor Allison even glanced back at it. By the time the 2 deputies from Chalice had joined him, Rick had already begun his search of the cabin. Joey had been here. He'd left tracks through the snow when he'd abandoned it. "Jeez," Tom Singlefeather breathed as he stepped through the door. "Why the hell would anyone live up here?" "Now that's exactly what we're going to find out," Martin told him. He glanced around the cabin, his conversation with Hank about the disappearing records fresh in his memory. "If we have to, we'll tear this place apart. There's got to be something up here that'll tell us what the feds won't." "What about this?" Tom asked. He was kneeling on the floor, prying up a loose floorboard. The floorboard came up, and Tom reached down and pulled out a brown metal box. Inside the box, Rick found a small book, Shane Slater's diary. The first words told it all. "I've made a deal. There's a new medical program being tested in the hospital, and they're looking for volunteers. They're promising early release to any of us they can sucker in, and they're making us sign waivers." Rick carefully turned to the last page, Slater's handwriting had changed. It was now barely a readable scrawl.
I keep changing, keep getting worse. When the night comes, I have to hunt. Hunt like a wolf. Someday someone will hunt me down, and then it will finally be over. For me, anyway. But what about Joey? What will happen to my son?
At the bottom of the box was a copy of the release Slater had signed. It had authorized the injection into his system of a serum containing the DNA of a non-human species, Canis lupus, the timber wolf. Dr. Cochran gazed at the documents on his desk, barely able to believe the results of the tests on Shane Slater's body. MaryAnne was sitting between Charlie and Rick, her face pale.
"Well," Rick asked, "what's the verdict?"
Cochran cleared his throat.
"There's, no question MaryAnne was right. Shane Slater was Joey's biological father."
MaryAnne felt weak. "But you said Joey is all right. You said—"
"I was wrong," Cochran said. "From what I've seen, there is no possible way Joey can be all right. When they experimented on Slater, they actually succeeded in altering his genetic structure. Almost certainly he's passed some of his—"
Cochran hesitated. A man of his education simply didn't use the word werewolf.
"He, would have passed some of his, mutations on to Joey."
MaryAnne's lips tightened, but she said nothing.
Rick stood. "Well, as soon as this thaws out, I'm putting together a team. We're gonna go search those mountains until we find Joey, and when we do—"
He cut his words short. Officers of the law simply did not set out to gun down a 13-year-old boy on sight. But that was exactly what he intended to do, and it might happen a lot sooner than anyone thought. As the meeting in Cochran's office broke up, Rick got into his Jeep and headed up to El Monte. Joey would come back there. He was almost certain of it, if for no other reason than hunger. By now, he must be very hungry indeed. Michael Stifel set out walking toward El Monte. In less than 10 minutes, he had come to the driveway. It wasn't until he was halfway up the drive that Michael began to feel nervous, as if he was being watched. He scanned the woods on both sides but saw nothing. Finally, he ran the rest of the way to the ranch. His heart pounding, Michael slowly moved around the barn. Maybe he shouldn't go in at all. "Chicken," he told himself. Michael resolutely pulled the barn door open. 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, and then he could go back, and he'd be home long before his folks and his sister returned from town. Then at school tomorrow, he could tell everyone what he'd done and what he'd seen. And he'd tell them he hadn't been scared at all. Joey moved silently through the woods, slipping from tree to tree. He'd been circling the ranch for more than an hour. This morning he had awakened hungry, his stomach growling. As the morning had worn on, he'd thought more and more about the food in the house. Surely no one would be there, not after what had happened. Leaving the wolf in the cave, he'd started down the mountain. Now he was there, and as he'd thought, the house was deserted, except that someone had nailed plywood over the broken window. He was able to pull the wood far enough from the window frame to slither over the sill and drop to the floor inside. He crouched, listening. The house was silent. He moved quickly into the kitchen, pulling open the refrigerator. On the bottom shelf, still on the plate, were the 5 steaks. Joey began tearing the raw meat into small chunks, shoving them into his mouth, swallowing them without chewing. His hunger sated, he moved to the stairs. He started upward, his nose suddenly filling with scents that stirred emotions within him. He came to his own room, but passed it by, moving on to another door. Inside the room, the odor of its occupant was still strong. Allison. Allison, who had always been kind to him. The closet was empty. His eyes darted to a scarf that hung over the footboard of the bed. He snatched it up, breathing in the smell that clung to it. Finally, he wrapped the cashmere around his neck, the scent of the girl comforting him. A minute later, he was back downstairs, throwing food into a bag. When he'd filled it, he slipped out and was about to head back when he saw that the barn door was open. He hesitated, then sniffed the air. Michael Stifel. Michael was in the barn, and his scent triggered memories in Joey. Memories of Michael taunting him, telling him he was crazy, whispering about him. Suddenly, Michael Stifel seemed to personify every slight and insult he'd suffered. His fury building, he dropped the bag of food and started toward the open barn door. Michael was pouring feed into the trough in Chica's stall when the big mare snorted, her eyes wide. "What is it?" Michael asked. "What the hell's wrong with you?" Now he realized that Buck and Fritz were also pawing the ground nervously. He moved to look at them. "What the hell's going on?" Then he suddenly had the same feeling of being watched that he'd felt a few minutes before, except this time it was stronger, much stronger. His eyes darted around for a weapon, a pitchfork. It was just across the aisle. Gathering what little courage he could muster, Michael grabbed the pitchfork. Just as his hands closed on it, he heard another sound directly behind him. Whirling around, the needle-sharp tines of the fork pointing straight out, Michael found himself gazing at Joey Wilkenson. Joey was staring back at him through narrowed eyes that flared with menace, and an image suddenly came into Michael's mind. An image of a wolf. "Oh, what do you want?" Michael asked. Joey glared at the boy who had taunted him all his life. "I'm crazy, Michael. It's finally true. All the things you ever said about me are finally true." "Leave me alone. I never did anything to you." "Yes, you did," Joey replied. "Do you know what's going to happen to you, Michael?" Michael tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Mutely, he stared at Joey. "I'm going to kill you, Michael." "No!" Michael, finding his voice at last, rushed at Joey. The tines of the pitchfork pointed directly at Joey's chest, but at the last second Joey stepped aside, his own hands closing on the fork's handle. Joey jerked the fork from his hands, and Michael turned to flee. He was almost to the tack room when Joey hurled the fork deep into the wood of the door. Michael's head was pinned to the door, 2 tines of the wide fork straddling his neck, the center tine piercing his carotid artery. A scream burst from Michael's throat, but it died away to a bubbling moan as his throat filled with blood that poured out of his mouth and nose. As he died, the last words he heard were Joey's. "It's only the beginning, Michael. It's only the beginning." Then, as Michael Stiffle died, dark laughter welled up from the depths of Joey's soul, and he walked out of the barn. As his ears detected the sound of a car coming up the road, he loped to the house, picked up the bag of food, and started toward the woods. As Rick pulled into the yard, he saw Joey across the field. His heart racing, he slammed the car to a halt. "Joey!" he yelled as he scrambled out and jerked his gun from its holster. "Joey Wilkenson!" Joey stopped short and turned as Rick, too quickly, pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, and then when he tried to aim again, Joey was gone. His laughter still echoing, Joey Wilkenson disappeared back into the mountains. Now it was finally over. MaryAnne had gotten through the funeral and the reception at the lodge following it, though she wasn't quite certain how. She was standing with Allison and Charlie at the door to the lodge as the last of the mourners were leaving. Now she and Allison could leave Sugarloaf. But where would they go? "Mom, do you know where we should go?" she suddenly heard Allison ask, as if the girl had read her mind. "I haven't even thought about it, darling." "Well, I have. You remember how Logan always wanted to go to California?" MaryAnne could only nod mutely. "Let's do it for him, Mom." Charlie spoke up. "You can leave right now, MaryAnne. All you have to do is put your bags in the station wagon and you can take off." "You're right," MaryAnne said. "Let's do it." 10 minutes later, her grief lifting slightly, she and Allison finished putting the luggage into the station wagon. Waving goodbye to Charlie as he drove away, they climbed into the front seat. MaryAnne looked at her daughter. "Are you sure you don't want to say goodbye to anyone else?" Allison shook her head. "I said goodbye to Logan at the cemetery. I think we should just go." MaryAnne put the car in gear. As they left the town of Sugarloaf forever, neither of them looked back. If they had, they might have seen Joey Wilkenson watching from the mountainside until the car finally disappeared. Only when it was gone did he at last start back up into the safety of the high country, the wolf limping at his side. "Don't worry," he said, dropping one hand to the wolf's head while the other stroked Allison's scarf, which was still around his neck. "We'll find her again. Wherever they go, somehow we'll find her."
Thanks for watching. Night, night. Don't let the bed bugs bite.